Withers. Contents. Acknowledgements. 9. Chapter 1. Building Models and Constructing Disability. 1. Models of Disability. 3. Disabled, non-disabled and disablism. 6. Privilege, lip service, and social change. 8. Chapter 2. The Eugenic Model. 13. Who is fit and who isn't. 14. Reducing the unfit, immigration. 19. Sterilization. 20. Feminist complicity. 21. Nazi eugenics. 23. North American eugenics after World War II. 25. Conclusion. 29. Chapter 3. Diagnosing people as problems. The medical model. 31. Medicalization. 32. Experts, the creation of knowledge and the maintenance of oppression. 34. The bell curve and the norm. 36. Medical gaze. 39. Medicine as control. 40. The medical model's implications on disabled lives. 41. Electroshock. Incarceration, experimentation, and medical killings. 44. What's wrong with disability? 47. Preventing disability before disability starts, prenatal screening. 49. Eugenics inside the medical model. 52. Conclusion. 54. Chapter 4. For us, not with us. The charity model. 57. Charities, big money, 58. Charity and corporations. 61. Disability, the product of charity. 66. Overcoming disability, supercrips, and the oblet disabled. 69. Segregated spaces, sheltered workshops and summer camps. 72. Internalization. 75. Charity or resistance. 77. Conclusion. 78. Chapter 5. The rights and social models. 81. The rights model. 81. The disability rights movement in the United States. 82. The disability rights movement in Canada. 84. Problems with rights-based approaches. 85. The social model. 86. Critiques of the social model. 89. The social model as a marginalizing force. 90. The social relational model. 93. The social model and impairment/disability, a false dichotomy. 95. Conclusion. 96. Chapter 6. The radical disability model. 98. Intersectionality. 99. Out from under disability. 101. Normal. Biological and political constructions. 108. Legislative definitions of disability. 110. Implications of definitions of disability. 112. Who is disabled? 113. Difficulty and trouble, real experiences of being disabled. 115. Radical access. 117. Conclusion. 119. This book is dedicated to Sarah and Amina. For an accessible, plain language guide to this book, please visit Acknowledgements. I have so many people to thank for their help, assistance, and support with this book. I owe a great debt to Lori Erickson. You have helped my politics evolve over the decade we have known each other, and you seem to always know when I should be challenged and when I should be comforted, which, at least with respect to me, is an impressive skill. Radical disability theory, too, would not exist without your co-development of it and the many Friday night fights and same Saturdays that it evolved from over the years. Laura Mack, thank you for your compassion, your support, and your loving and quiet approach to disability politics. I am so grateful to have you in my life. You have provided countless amounts of feedback, insight, and assistance with this book. You have tolerated my interrupting you all the time to run something by you / as well as the fact that sometimes one have talked about little else but this book. Thank you for all the times you did the dishes, made me dinner or did any other fabulous housemate / best friend things while I was writing frantically. You have provided me with immeasurable amounts of support in this project, for which I am forever grateful. Also, thanks to Sarah Mangle for helping keep the house together when I was writing, for making me food when I wasn't taking care of myself, and for your thoughtful comments. Also, thanks for bringing LD into my life. Thank you to everyone in the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. I grew up in OCAP and owe a tremendous debt to many of its members for their mentorship, support, and solidarity. And, specifically, I want to thank Sue Collis, for not only being an incredible teacher and example, but also for having more faith in me than I did myself. This book came out of a conversation that one had with Sue in the car, so, thanks for that conversation and for the ride to Kitchener. Thanks to John Clark and Gayton Heru for putting up with me and providing me with a decade's worth of quiet and respectful guidance. Thanks to Sarah Vance for being such a strong organizer and person, and for so eagerly and diligently providing me with feedback and support. And special thanks to Stephanie Good for being who you are, for always setting an example, and for being the one to help with some of the more boring parts of this project. I always appreciate your insight, wisdom, and generosity, and you deserve so much more credit than you let yourself have. Also, my deepest appreciation to Sean Brandt. Thank you for kicking me in the ass more than once and for being the person I could look to whenever I lost faith. Extra special thanks to Griffin Epstein for your brilliant and challenging comments and your conversations and company. There have been so many. 9. Times when I have felt completely stuck, and your encouragement has helped me through. There have been other times when you have said something that made my brain spiral again and again, and I couldn't stop writing. Thank you for the important feedback on this entire manuscript, as well as for your help with the many hours of research. Disability organizing in Toronto and the radical disability model would not be what it is today without your important interventions and contributions. Sean Lee Popham, it has been a long road and we have been through a lot together. Thank you for everything. And thank you Sean, Brian, and Connor for providing me with a cairn, beautiful space to hide out and hang out in. Jeffrey Riam, thanks for the challenging and insightful conversations in recent months about disability models. Also, I want to thank you, Mom, for your support, for your compassion, and for picking up on things that I don't always think you will. To Matt Leitold, thank you for your years of friendship and unwavering support. One know how hard it has been, and you have my gratitude and my admiration. You have been so important in my life, and we both know there were times that I simply wouldn't have made it through without you. My little sister Meg Leitold, you have been very supportive and thoughtful throughout this project, and one have valued it deeply. To all the Leitolds and Kings for welcoming me into your family, for your friendship and your generosity, thank you. One also want to extend my gratitude to everyone who took the time to review all or part of the drafts of this manuscript, including Alicia Cuff, Richard Laviolette, Griffin Epstein, Mel Gale, Stephanie Giude, Meg Leitold, Lisa Linvier, Laura MacDonald, Andrew Mindsenthy, Lenny Olin, Sarah Vance, Leslie Wood, and the 3 anonymous reviewers. Wayne Anthony, thank you for your experienced and thoughtful guidance through this project while respecting my politics and my voice. I have had to frame my analysis in order to do educational workshops, which helped me frame this book. I am grateful to everyone who has planned and presented workshops with me over the years, including Candice Ferguson, Leah Dalmage, Meg Leitold, Aisha Muzie, Caligula Caesar, and Amanda Dorter. Lastly, to Davy Parsons, thanks for your friendship and support. Thanks also to the people at Fernwood who helped make this project corporeal. Thanks, especially, to the already mentioned Wayne Anthony, John Vander Woud for the cover design, and to Beverly Ratch and Debbie Mathers for their production and pre-production expertise, respectively. Thanks also to Curran Ferris for the thorough and detailed copy editing. Chapter 1. Building Models and Constructing Disability. The fanciest party I ever threw was in celebration of the government officially recognizing me as disabled. Normally such an occasion would have been met with extreme poverty, but not this day. This particular day was filled with pot pies, stuffed mushrooms, luxurious cheeses, wine and raspberry mousse in tiny chocolate cups. My declaration of disability came with a $12,000 check. Like many things that come from the government, however, there were strings attached. I had to spend all but S3,000 in 6 months without acquiring any non-exempt assets, otherwise my disability check would be suspended. So, I went on a road trip with some friends to Dollywood in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, bought a lot of things I needed but had gone without over the years, gave some money away, paid some bills and threw this party. The party was a thank you to the people in my community who had been generous with me over the years. These folks had let me come along in their cars without asking me to pay for gas and eat their food without paying them back, or they were part of my care collective, helping me shop, clean, cook and do laundry when needed. I almost always met this generosity with frugality, because I was trying to get by on welfare in Toronto, one of the most expensive cities in the country. The check that made me $1,000 was back pay. It was money I was owed for the 2.5 years that it had taken to navigate the snail's pace disability benefits system. THI check didn't, of course, include the several years I had lived solely on welfare prior to submitting my disability application forms. I had repeatedly asked my doctor to complete my application, but each time she told me, "We'll have you better in 6 months." 6 months later, I would ask again until, finally, she agreed. Once my application was complete, including multiple letters from specialists, medical reports, and my own personal statement, I sent it off and waited for nearly 8 months, only to be denied. I knew in advance that this would happen. About half of those who apply for the Ontario Disability Support Program, or disability as those of us who receive support often call it, are initially denied. 1. 2. Notably, 60% of applications submitted are accepted on appeal. This increase in my income, nearly double the amount I received on welfare, means that things are much better for me. However, disability rates in Ontario are still poverty rates. A basic ODSP check amounts to roughly $100 more than the average rent of a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto. A single person on ODSP has an income of only 71% of the poverty line, was on welfare for many years, just like the many disabled people who cannot find accessible work, who are waiting to receive ODSP or who don't qualify for ODSP. Currently, people on welfare have an income that is only 42% of the poverty line. Until the government classified me as disabled, for the sake of receiving disability benefits, I operated in a legal realm where I was simultaneously disabled and not disabled. The government declaration that I was disabled under the law did not change anything about me, except my bank balance. For the purposes of human rights legislation and access to a seat at the front of the bus, one was disabled. These practices and policies, while important, provide few meaningful benefits to disabled people and have broad, inclusive definitions of disability. However, for the purposes of having enough money to live off, I was not disabled. IHE definition of disabled to qualify for social assistance is incredibly narrow, so a very limited number of people receive any money. It was this shifting nature of the definition of disability that got me interested in figuring out what exactly disability is. How is it that people can move back and forth, being disabled and non-disabled through a change in policy or medical definition, while nothing actually changes about their bodies or minds? How can someone be disabled and non-disabled at the same time? IHE conclusion I came to is fairly simple: disability is a construct. Because disability, like other marginalities, is contextual, you cannot actually understand where disability is without understanding where disability has been. There is a great deal of diversity in how disability is viewed, depending on culture, place, or period in time. IHE ways in which disability is perceived and defined fundamentally change depending on the context in which it is viewed in. The ways in which disability is viewed are always informed by class, gender, race, and age, among other marginalities. While the definition of disability has shifted throughout time and varies with context, inherent to the definition is a sense of abnormality, a deviation from the norm. High norm, too, however, is culturally contingent. Leonard J. Davis writes that the idea of a norm is less a condition of human nature than it is a feature of a certain kind of society. Davis also points out that the contemporary ideas of normal and average are relatively new. Until 1840, in fact, normal was only used in the mathematical sense, to mean perpendicular. Models of disability. This book argues that disability is a construct. Further, this book makes the case that disability is understood through models of thought and action. These models are pervasive at certain times or sites in culture. This book outlines 6 main models of inventing, understanding and managing the concept of disability within Western societies: the eugenic model, the medical model, the charity model, the rights model, the social model and, finally, the radical model. This list is by no means complete. There are many more models including, but not limited to, the individual model, the middle range adjustment model, the social death model, the social barriers model, the administrative model, the socio-medical model, the socio-political model, the personal tragedy model, the social role valorization model, the cultural model, the affirmation model, the independent living model, the moral model, the World Health Organization model, the structural model, the minority model, the socio-spatial model, the wholly innocent model, the subhuman organism model, the menace model and the developmental model. Such a proliferation of models exists that Michael Oliver said, "At one point it seemed that we would end up with more models than the Lucy Clayton Modeling Agency." There are so many models for inventing and understanding disability because disability is not a fixed category. Rather, it is a fluid definition that depends not only on the context in which it is defined, but also who defines it. The models examined in this book are those I consider to be the most influential and/or important in Western society. The models of disability, however, do not have fixed borders. Rather, they can be porous, bleeding into each other or reinforcing one another. The foundations of the modern conceptualizations of disability were laid with the advent of eugenics. Eugenics is based in a belief that certain people are genetically superior to others and that people deemed inferior pollute the gene pool, diminishing the strength and desirability of the entire population. Eugenicists, fueled by capitalist ideals and industrialist values, promote selective breeding in order to encourage population growth of desirable people and a reduction of undesirable people, until the latter are eliminated. Eugenics created the first modern classification of disability. It continues. To have a tremendous influence on views of disability today. Leonard J. Davis writes, Eugenics saw the possible improvement of the race as being accomplished by diminishing problematic peoples and their problematic behaviors. These peoples were clearly delineated under the rubric of feeble-mindedness and degeneration as women, people of color, homosexuals, the working class and so on. All these were considered to be categories of disability, although we do not think of them as connected in this way today. Originally, the concept of disability applied to any number of people who were considered to have genetically and socially undesirable traits. This broad definition of disability, upheld in the late 1800s and early 1900s, demonstrates how its categorization was used to further marginalize and control large groups of people and to enforce social norms. The medical model of disability has been the primary paradigm for understanding disability since the decline of eugenics. The medical model views disability as an individual tragedy and as based within the body. Despite the medical model's seeming differences, it is not always distinct from eugenics. There was a great deal of overlap between the two during the height of eugenics. Today, the medical model often draws on eugenics and continues in its legacy. There is sometimes a separation made between the medical model of disability and the rehabilitation model of disability. Both the medical model and the rehabilitation model are centered around individual bodies and minds and are invested in expert LC&LH. The difference between the two, argues David Pfeiffer, is that the medical model focuses on curing disability while the rehabilitation model focuses on diminishing, adapting, or concealing disability. Uris model is, however, a derivative of the medical model. I do not think that the distinction between the medical model and rehabilitation is at all substantial enough to warrant a separate model, and, as such, I discuss it within the framework of the medical model. Complementary to the medical model is the charity model of disability. In its current form, the charity model reinforces the medical model, accepting medicalization as the primary way of defining disability. However, it provides a softer side to the mainstream approach to disability, framing disability as a tragedy and something that can be resisted. If enough people come together to insert ultimately eradicating disability and, therefore, disabled people. Some have argued that the charity, medical and eugenic models are all components of an individual model of disability. For instance, Michael Olive E.R. argues that there is no such thing as the medical model of disability, there is instead, an individual model of disability of which medicalization is one significant component. For Oliver, who is one of the most influential disability studies scholars, there are only two models, the individual and the social. While Oliver would likely categorize the eugenic, medical and charity models together, there are important differences between them. Each model has different conceptualizations of disability, different actors, and different effects. Oliver is right that these models all have an individual focus, and the boundaries between them may be blurry at the edges or they may overlap. However, the three models are distinct approaches to disability and warrant separate discussions. In the 1970s, disabled activists reacted strongly and publicly to the eugenic, medical and charity models of disability. Disabled organizers in the United States and Canada responded to these brutal modes of understanding and managing disability by taking a rights-based approach. Activists in the United Kingdom created an entirely new model for understanding disability, the social model, which spread internationally. The rights model focused on accessing society, but the social model focused on changing society. Both models, however, drew from other struggles and social movements. The people who developed the social model were engaged in social action, and their new discourse not only changed the conversation about disability, but also presented a new framework in which disabled people could be united and organized. As a result, the social model became highly influential in disability politics in North America and across the globe. This new social model separated disability from impairment, one defining disability as the oppression imposed on disabled people as a result of our impairments. The social model took the focus off of disabled people's individual limitations and focused on the inaccessibility of the built environment and society. However, the social model has limitations and, in many circumstances, helps to perpetuate the oppression of disabled people. I propose an alternative model for understanding disability, which I call the radical model. His model specifically takes up the social model's separation of impairment from disability, a false binary that was a useful explanatory tool at one time but has long since become a tool of continued oppression. We put social meaning onto people's bodies and minds. Impairment shifts depending on the context that it is experienced in. I do not argue that there is no biological function or reality at play with our minds and our bodies, we are physical beings. However, we put social meaning onto that biology, and we cannot separate the two. There is no such thing as a biological reality that creates impairment. Impairment is socially constructed and imposed upon us, just as disability is. 6/ To the disabled community and the disability rights movement, it is time to rejoin disability and impairment and create a new disability paradigm. The radical disability model maintains that there is nothing wrong with us. We are only disabled because we are identified as such by existing power structures, as a way to keep those power structures intact. While definitions and ways of understanding disability have changed, there is one commonality among disabled people, at least for the past century and a half in Western cultures. It is that ideal is white, straight, productive, profitable and patriarchal. Disabled people are labeled disabled because we challenge the notion of the ideal. Radical disability politics is grounded in the belief that the systems that oppress us, not us, are fundamentally flawed. These systems manipulate the definition of disability, depending on their needs, resulting in a constantly changing and shifting understanding of disability over time. Because disability is different in different cultures and contexts, in this book I speak only to the dominant Canadian and American constructions of disability. Perhaps when you picked up this book you had a specific idea about what disability was, but there is no universal definition of disability. Disabled, non-disabled and disablism. All of the models of disability are used to define groups of people as disabled. Different groups of people are classified as disabled or not based on the model being used. But what do you call those of us who have been labeled as disabled? There are a number of different names that are, or have been, used for us, most of them oppressive. These days the acceptable terms are generally considered to be people with disabilities or disabled people, and both are sometimes used interchangeably. Oftentimes, though, people use one or the other because they believe it to be correct. Thai term people with disabilities is part of a broader lexicon called People First language. The rationale for using this language, according to Cathy Snow, the mother of a person with a disability, is that people with disabilities are people, first. Proponents of this language say disabled is an inappropriate word because of its other meanings, broken/non-functioning. Disabled author Ruth Enns argues the phrase is an effort to put their human status ahead of their disabilities. There are some major problems with the people first approach. This language often comes from people who are not disabled but claim to work in our interests. The language also implies that disability is something separate and apart from personhood or humanity, unfortunate/7 conditions attached to otherwise normal people. Other criticisms involve the ease of interchangeability of the word disability with medical diagnoses, people with autism, people with spinal muscular atrophy, people with schizophrenia, people with epilepsy, people with disabilities and so on. This is problematic because it lends itself so easily to medical discourse, something that many disabled people resist. The phrase disabled people does not treat disability as passive or an afterthought. Disability exists as a consequence of an active process of marginalization. People are disabled. Disability is something that is imposed on us. While the phrase has a negative connotation, I argue that disabled people have largely reclaimed it. We are disabled. But what of those of us who are not categorized in this way? Within mainstream disability rights and public discourse in Canada and the United States, the term able-bodied has seeped into popular usage. This is a reflection of the dominance of physically disabled people within disability rights movements. Sometimes temporarily able-bodied is used to illustrate the fact that most people will be disabled at some point. Obviously, many people who are intellectually or psychiatrically disabled are erased from the disabled community if this term is used. Contrary to popular understanding, however, all disabled people, including physically disabled people, can be, and are, disabled and able-bodied simultaneously. Indeed, able-bodied and disabled are not oppositional or necessarily even different. While I have a physical disability, I am alive because of my able body. I will not be able-bodied one day. That will be the day that I die. My body keeps me alive, it sustains me, it allows me to experience and perceive. I am able-bodied. The opposite of disabled is simply non-disabled. However, this too is problematic because it presents disability as a clear category that everyone either fails into or outside of. The reality is that disability is in constant flux and people move in and out of the category depending on context. Margaret Childrick points out that using the categories of disabled and non-disabled works to uphold the problematic and false binary and the systems that permit their creation. But, while the business of naming can be problematic, even contradictory, and language can limit the way we conceptualize things, it is an important starting point to building unity and creating space to work together. The oppression that disabled people experience is disablism. Disablism is defined by Miller, Parker, and Gillinson as discriminatory, oppressive or abusive behavior arising from the belief that disabled people are inferior to others. Nevertheless, Ableism is a word that is often used to describe our oppression. Sometimes people go back and forth between the two terms, but 8/ frequently word use is determined by geography. North Americans commonly use the term ableism/ while disableism is preferred by the British. However, I believe that ableism is a misnomer. Ableism implies that one is being oppressed because of ability when, in reality, one experiences oppression because of disability, privilege, lip service, and social change. While much of this book discusses various models of disability, a knowledge of theory is not particularly useful without action. I provide context and insight into disability and how and why it is constructed. But fundamentally, I hope that this book will incite people to take an active role in working for change that is inclusive of disability politics and disabled people. It is imperative to note that I do not speak for disabled people. My experience, like that of all disabled people, is unique. I am white, while most disabled people are not. It is also impossible, at times, to separate where my disability begins and my transsexuality, poverty, and queerness end, even though all of these things have, at times, also been considered disabilities. I also live with full immigration status in Canada. Canada is one of the richest countries in the world, and much of the wealth held in this country originates from the stolen land, resources, and cultures of First Nations people, who have rates of disability almost twice as high as the rest of the population in Canada. Much of Canada's remaining wealth is derived from the theft of resources from other Indigenous people around the world. I have a tremendous amount of privilege as a disabled person because I live in Canada, and my perspective informs my understanding of disability. Another point of my privilege is that I can also pass as non-disabled a fair amount of the time if I so choose. When my life is such that I wouldn't pass as non-disabled, I am frequently unable to leave my house. Therefore, under certain circumstances, I can choose when, and to whom, to come out to as disabled. My experience of disability is also informed by the fact that I am a political organizer and believe strongly that our systems of governance and economics are fundamentally flawed and cannot be reformed, rather, they should be overthrown. As an activist, being disabled has been a lonely and hard place. When I began researching, writing about and whirling on disability politics, I understood that disability was, at best, tacked onto the list the series of oppressions that we are against or people we are in solidarity with. I couldn't find books about disability in political bookstores, and no one I knew ever went to disabled people's protests or even knew they were happening. No one was talking about disability, and everyone in activist circles around me identified as or was assumed to be non-disabled. 9. One of the first times I really felt the impacts of the lip service of the list was about 10 years ago at a social justice conference for students. This was my second time doing an anti-disablism workshop, and it was the first time this type of workshop had ever been done at the annual conference. I went into the room early to set up an activity I had made. I taped up words like GIMP, written on about 20 large pieces of paper all around the room. The activity involved having people draw several cards, on some of which were written the words people meant to say when they used these slurs, while the other cards had the definitions or origins of the words. The participants were to match the cards with the words on the walls, and then we would talk about language. The only person who came to the workshop was the woman who was supposed to introduce me. All of the 10 to 15 other organizers and the 60 or 70 participants of the conference chose to attend one of the other two workshops. Once she left the room, I sat down, surrounded by all the words that bombard and devalue disabled people. As the cards fluttered in the breeze from the central air, I began to cry. After a while I got used to being asked to do workshops and having no one show up. Sometime after that, I started refusing to do them unless I was guaranteed that a certain number of people would be there, or that the workshop wouldn't be competing against other oppressed groups for an audience. I got tired of constantly being reminded that progressives didn't think disability or disabled people were important. Over the past decade, however, I have seen an increase in people's level of engagement around disability issues. This excites me. Not only does there seem to be an increased awareness about disability issues, at least in some communities that I organize with, but there also seems to be a hunger developing amongst some disabled and non-disabled people for information and representation. These days when I do workshops, people come. I often start them off by asking a series of questions. The first question is, do you identify as disabled? In a room with 50 people in it, 4 or 5 will put up their hands. On reading the second question, are you identified or do you identify as disabled, a few more hands will reluctantly rise. Before reading the lengthy third question, I ask people to not raise their hands until I am finished. Then, I ask, do you have a psychiatric diagnosis, do you take psych meds, have you ever been under a community treatment order or incarcerated in a psych facility? Have you been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, are you neuroatypical or neurodiverse? Do you have a terminal illness, a chronic illness, chronic fatigue, or chronic pain? Are 10/ you a foot fetishist? Do you have a genetic or congenital disease? Are you a drug addict or alcoholic? Do you use a wheelchair or mobility aid? Do you use braces, a cane, or crutches, have difficulty walking or do not walk? Are you a transsexual? Do you have asthma? Are you an amputee? Are you intersexed and currently have non-gender conforming genitals and / or appearance? Do you have a learning, intellectual or cognitive disability? Are you fat? Are you deaf or hard of hearing? Are you blind or do you have low vision? Are you HIV positive or do you have AIDS? Are you a heterosexual male who cross-dresses and is severely distressed by it, or are you gay and severely distressed by it? When I tell people to raise their hands, usually well over half of the room, and, on occasion, the whole room, puts their hands up, some proudly and others very reluctantly. Finally, I ask, did you answer yes to any of the questions that have been asked, or could you have but you didn't because of stigma, fear, shame, apathy, or any other reason? At this point the number of hands in the air has multiplied dramatically from the first question, and I tell everyone that this is who I am talking about when I talk about disabled people. Of course, this list is incomplete and there are problems with this exercise, but I think it is a useful demonstration. While one do think there has been an improvement over the years in the number of people who are concerned with disability issues, it is important for non-disabled activists to understand that it is hard for many disabled activists to extend trust after generations of exclusion and erasure. One of the causes of this mistrust is that, for the most part, our histories have been deleted from the history of the left. Disabled people like Rosa Luxemburg and Antonio Gramsci have had their disabilities erased or diminutivized, or, as Helen Keller exemplifies, their radical politics have been erased. Direct actions by the disability rights movement have not been celebrated, studied, or replicated in the ways that actions by other movements have been. And, perhaps most significantly, the complicity of the left in disabled people's marginalization has been largely omitted from historical accounts of social justice movements. Adding us to the list is relatively meaningless as long as there is no acknowledgement of this rewritten history and the resulting, and legitimate, skepticism of radical movements by disabled people. Perhaps one of the primary reasons that disabled people have been actively excluded from the left is because there is an unspoken belief, held by other leftists, that we are broken or flawed. Douglas Bainton writes, rarely have oppressed groups denied that disability is an adequate /11 justification for social and political inequality. Thus, while disabled people can be considered one of the minority groups historically assigned inferior status and subjected to discrimination, disability has functioned for all such groups as a sign of and justification for inferiority. Such conclusions are often made without talking to disabled people. There is an assumption that disablism is not a form of oppression to the same degree as other forms of oppressions because it is somehow justified, and thus, no effort is made to make meetings socially, linguistically, or physically accessible. No resources are allocated to anti-disablism education, and no space is created to hear about disability or to listen to disabled people. Therefore, nothing is learned about our lives, and our experiences as oppressed people continue to be devalued. Social justice can never be achieved without working with disabled people and on disability issues. THI construction of disability is an essential tool for how people with power work to maintain that power. Without targeting disability specifically and simultaneously recognizing and responding to its intersectionality with other oppressions, the systems and values that create disability will remain intact, replicating disablism. Similarly, disabled people, who often organize apart from the rest of the left, cannot expect to be victorious in fighting for justice without resisting other forms of oppression. Most disabled people have at least 2 points of marginality. Most of us are women, racialized, poor, queer or any such combination. Internationally, the vast majority of disabled people are racialized. Further, in Canada most disabled people are women. Disabled people are not a homogeneous group, we are diverse and impacted by different oppressions. We cannot successfully fight for the insertion of disability into mainstream society at the expense of others, particularly because most disabled people would be left behind in such a struggle. While I have written extensively about theory, I have done it in this context of intersecting oppressions and struggles and with an understanding of the urgency of the need for change. Uli's book is similarly situated. While we desperately need more education around disability issues, we need action just as much or more. We need people to organize their communities and to build movements. So, read on and resist. Chapter 2. Constructing Difference. Controlling Deviance. The Eugenic Model. Eugenics is the belief that human evolution can be crafted by the encouraged breeding of people who are considered the most desirable, the fit, and the discouraged breeding of those who are considered the least desirable, the unfit. Eugenics is inspired by evolutionary theory and operates under the assumption that humans can shape our own evolution in positive ways by engaging in selective breeding. The word itself is a creation of Sir Francis Galton, the father of eugenics, and is based on the Greek word eugenies, meaning well-born or good stock. While Galton's theories were first published in 1865, he did not coin the word eugenics until 1883 in Inquiries into Human Faculty and its Development. The word Galton used prior to eugenics was viticulture. There are different ways of going about achieving eugenic goals, and they are generally defined as either negative or positive eugenics. Negative eugenics focuses on the reduction of reproduction amongst those who are considered undesirable. Positive eugenics focuses on increasing reproduction of those who are considered desirable. Further, eugenicists also differentiate between forms of eugenic programs. These programs can happen through insidious forms of control or coercion of reproduction, called passive eugenics, or through active eugenics, the implementation of programs that force eugenics onto people. In 1865, Galton formulated the theory of eugenics, and with it the first cohesive ideas about a class of disabled people, or the unfit, were born in modern Western society. Galton saw eugenics both as the science of improving inherited stock, not only by judicious matings, but by all the influences which give more suitable strains a better chance, and as a way to give the more suitable races a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. Galton strongly believed that unfit people were reproducing at an alarming rate. He wanted to see the undesirables be got 14/ rid of and the desirables multiplied. Of course, Galton's views of fitness, or disability, were based on the social, cultural, and economic views at the time. THI eugenic model conceptualized disability as being in the individual body and as inheritable. Simply disabled people were unfit to live in society, unfit to exist. Eugenicists believed eugenics offered a solution to disability, a way to eradicate disability from society. This model envisioned disability as a threat to society and to those considered fit. Primarily, eugenics honed in on all of those individuals who were struggling in society, labeled them as disabled and targeted them for eradication. The eugenic model constructed disability with such rabid contempt that its proponents would, and did, do anything to get rid of the problem disabled people posed, including murder. The early part of the 20th century saw an explosion in support for eugenics. A boon to the cause occurred when Galton's cousin, Charles Darwin, publicly declared his support for eugenics. Eugenic organizations were established, including the American Breeders Association's Eugenics Committee, the United Farm Women of Alberta, the English Eugenics Education Society and the Racial Hygiene Society. A number of prominent people were involved in these organizations early on, including Alexander Graham Bell, Stanford professor Vernon Kellogg, U.S. Assistant Secretary of Agriculture Willett M. Hayes, Dutch geneticist Hugo de Vries, activist and soon-to-be Alberta MLA Irene Parlby, German biologist. Alfred Ploetz and, of course, Francis Galton. Eugenic movements also sprang up around the same time in Brazil, Norway, and Russia, among many other places. The eugenic movement had its peak in the 1930s and 1940s and declined after the defeat of the Nazis, who had implemented horrific mass eugenic policies. However, eugenics made up the foundation of the modern Western understanding of disability, and its influences can be found in other mainstream models of disability. Some of the eugenic attitudes about disabled people and their reproduction remain present today. Who is fit and who isn't? The eugenic worldview was a binary one in which there were two classes of people, those considered fit and those considered unfit. The unfit class created the foundation for what is considered disability today. Who is considered disabled today, along with women, racial, Z people, homosexuals, queers, poor and working class people, were all considered disabled under eugenics. Ml of these attributes were considered to be negative and perceived to be inheritable, thus they were all presumed to be physical conditions. The elimination of these conditions, the elimination of disability, eugenicists believed would lead to a more productive and far less troubled society. Feeble-mindedness had a number of different definitions. One of these definitions was being unable to finish third grade. This definition failed to problematize the education system, the discrimination within it, or any of the social factors that would prevent children from being able to attend or remain in school. Eugenicist Amos Butler wrote, "Feeble-mindedness is one of the most potential destructive factors in our civilization. It produces more pauperism, more crime, more degeneracy than any other one force." This ideology put the blame of social problems directly on those people who experienced the brunt of those problems. Therefore, eugenic ideas were highly popular amongst the upper classes, as eugenics explained away social problems by blaming the people who were the most negatively impacted by existing oppressions. The solution? Eliminate the people who cause the problems. With eugenics, there was no need for systemic change, only a change in who was a part of society. Many of the eugenic solutions were adopted from Reverend Thomas Malthus. Malthus, a British author who wrote extensively about population, economics, and politics in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, called for a widespread reduction in the global population. Malthus argued for the removal of poor laws and of the meager poor assistance systems of the time. He believed giving assistance to the poor would encourage them to have more children, thus, the population would increase, ultimately resulting in famine and war. Malthus said, "We are bound in justice and honor formally to disclaim the right of the poor to support." Malthus held that the poor should be removed from society by encouraging death and disease. We should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction, which we compel nature to use. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlements in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases, and those benevolent, but much mistaken men, who have thought they were doing a service to mankind by projecting schemes for the total extrapolation of particular disorders. 16/ He went on to argue that increased mortality would reduce the population to a sustainable level that would not result in mass hunger. From a eugenic perspective, it was not only acceptable to permit people to live in abject poverty, it was preferred. This would allow evolution to take its course and cull those considered unfit. It was no coincidence that the eugenic movement developed shortly after the Industrial Revolution, as it provided the perfect explanation for massive disparities in wealth as well as the increasing poverty and suffering among the working class. Eugenics provided those with power a justification for that power as well as a rationalization for the injustices and inequalities that industrial capitalism and colonialism brought forth in new and increasingly violent ways. The unfit were largely classified as such because they were considered unproductive or underproductive within the capitalist economy. Leonard Darwin argued that eugenic targets included the immoral, the inefficient, the stupid, the unemployable, the weakly, etc. Many years later, eugenicist Frederick Osborn would assert, achievement in building a home as well as success in other aspects of life constitutes a eugenic criterion. These statements illustrate the true motives of eugenic thought, to legitimize the oppression of groups of people by identifying them as defective, unfit, and disabled, and to use that legitimacy to perpetuate oppression. Eugenics formed a seemingly scientific way to establish an other and to legitimize erring the process of establishing a group identity by stigmatizing and devaluing certain people. The individual and multiple identities of people who were labeled as other were replaced by one group identity or trait. Eugenics created the other as the unfit and targeted them for elimination. Within eugenics, economic or political realities such as poverty are not caused by injustice but by genetically inherited traits. Social conditions and economic inequalities were considered individual heritable failings. Charles Davenport, one of the most prominent American eugenicists, argued that poor people were genetically unable to participate in competitive capitalist economies and support themselves. Davenport wrote of the right to legal abortions. Since surgical sterilizations remained free on demand, more and more poor women have been forced to opt for permanent infertility. While these sterilizations may not be legally forced, many women feel that they have no other options because of governmental policies. The organization Project Prevention operates openly in the United States. Project Prevention pays women who are drug users or alcoholics $300 to get permanently sterilized. Project Prevention founder Barbara Harris says that what separates this organization from many others is that we work to prevent a problem rather than spending the money we receive to treat one. /27. Ad on Project Prevention's website shows a very young baby covered with a number of medical wires and tubes, including one on its nose, that take up about a quarter of the baby's face with the text, "Attention drug addicts and alcoholics, get birth control. Get $300. Make the call today, 888-30-CRACK." The image on the advertisement makes it clear that it is these kinds of babies, disabled babies, which are purportedly being prevented through the project. The website also views the life of a disabled child solely as a financial drain or burden. The cost of hospitalization for a very low birth weight baby in need of intensive care can be as high as $150,000 or more. Thai annual medical cost of caring for cocaine-exposed babies nationwide has been estimated at $33 million for neonates, and as high as $1.4 billion during the baby's first year of life. Focusing on the cost of medical care for these disabled children reduces lives to dollar amounts and harkens back to when eugenics was in its prime. Thai organization intones that the lives of disabled people are too expensive for our economy and our society and, therefore, should be prevented. Project Prevention has paid about 3,850 people to keep from reproducing through long-term birth control or sterilization. About half of the people who have been paid by Project Prevention not to have children are from racialized groups. The program has seen the sterilization or implementation of long-term birth control in drug addicts and alcoholics in every American state in Canada. A 1986 Supreme Court decision made sterilizations without consent for non-therapeutic purposes illegal. The case that set the precedent, E.V.S. Eve, involved a 24-year-old woman with an intellectual disability whose mother wished to have her sterilized. In this case, a lower court ruled that the real and genuine object of the proposed sterilization was her protection. There was no overriding public interest against it. Thai Supreme Court overruled this decision, arguing that the intrusion on the person's civil liberties and permanent physical consequences cannot be overridden by any advantage from it. However, in the Eve decision, the Supreme Court left the door open to forced sterilization when it permitted non-consensual sterilization for the treatment of a serious malady. While the Supreme Court set the burden high in respect to non-consensual sterilization, there are no clear guidelines as to when or under what circumstances forced sterilization of disabled people would be justified. There are myriad cases revealing that eugenics continues to operate through legal and medical frameworks today. Take, for example, the case of Martina 28/ Greywind, a pregnant woman charged with reckless endangerment in 1992 because she huffed paint during her pregnancy. After Greywind aborted her fetus, ensuring that a disabled baby would not be born as a result of her drug use, the charges against her were withdrawn. Every time a pregnancy is intervened upon to prevent disability, eugenics is operating. Every time someone is sterilized or administered birth control against their will or without their knowledge, eugenics is operating. Eugenics is insidious and pervasive and continues to be a threat to disabled people, especially racialized disabled people and/or disabled women. Additionally, there are more simplistic forms of controlling the reproductive capacity of disabled women than sterilization. These include the non-consensual, coerced or uninformed administration of birth control and eugenic pressures. Disabled women have been known to be administered DEPO-RA, a long-term birth control drug, without their consent. These practices are a form of passive eugenics that work to appropriate women's choice and reproductive capacity in order to eliminate disabled offspring. Further, disabled women are pressured not to have children if those children could also become disabled. In 1968, eugenicist Frederick Osborne expressed this fact. Perhaps the most important function of the public is to create a climate of opinion that will put pressure on carriers of defect to reduce their reproduction, and on scientists in medicine and public health to put priority on all studies that might provide leads for effective action. This pressure has been applied to many different disabled women through genetic counseling and, at times, public outcry about their pregnancies. One example of this was the public reaction when Bree Walker, a disabled anchorwoman, became pregnant. At a time when she should have been congratulated, she was faced with national public pressure to have an abortion. People were enraged and disgusted by the fact that someone would choose to have a child that had a 50-50 chance of inheriting the same disability. On a radio phone-in show, one listener said Walker had no right to become pregnant and should have an abortion. Ms. Walker spoke out against the vocally disabled people pressuring her not to proceed with her pregnancy or vilifying her for getting pregnant. Walker says, "I was told by CBS management that this was a troublesome issue and that my choosing to speak out instead of just letting it go away presented a thorny issue for them." Walker was condemned because of the eugenic values that are still held today, although they are rarely called that. 29. Eugenics continues to operate in the immigration system as well. While overtly racist quotas have been removed from Canadian and American immigration acts, their disbiased intentions to exclude people who are unfit remain intact. In Canada, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act states that one can be deemed inadmissible if their condition might reasonably be expected to cause excessive demand on health or social services. In recent years, people have been excluded from entering Canada for conditions like arthritis, cerebral palsy, intellectual disabilities, and for being quadriplegic. Immigration policies carry eugenic legacies, as do reproductive health programs in the United States. In 1968, Frederick Osborne wrote, "Eugenic goals are most likely to be attained under a name other than eugenics." He went on to outline a number of eugenic achievements in post-war America, including the use of genetic counseling, which has dramatically increased since the 1960s. Eugenic organizations commonly changed their names, becoming genetic organizations, 11 and much of the racist, chicist, and disableist materials being taught in science classes before the war continued to be taught in the post-war era. Frederick Osborne, Harry Laughlin of the Eugenic Records Office and a number of other prominent eugenicists founded the Pioneer Fund in 1937. According to the Pioneer Fund's website, the organization was founded to advance the scientific study of heredity and human differences. The organization, which continues to operate to this day, distributes grants adding up to about 81 million a year and has awarded money to a number of major colleges and universities. 12 At the University of Waterloo, the Pioneer Fund has financed a current tenured Prof. Sr. J. Philip Rushton, who has done research trying to substantiate eugenic theories that black people have higher sex drives and smaller brains than white people. High Fund has also bankrolled current professor of educational psychology at the University of Delaware, Linda Gottfredson, who has put forward theories about the inferiority of black people's intelligence. Conclusion: eugenics has not disappeared, it is in our universities, in our courts, in our hospitals, at the border and on television. High eugenics model of disability lies at the foundations of how we think of disability today. Eugenics classified all people in one of two ways, fit or unfit. High entire category of unfit made up who was defined as disabled at the time. Disability, to a eugenicist, is an 30/undesirable heritable flaw that threatens to destabilize society as a whole and should be eliminated. While eugenics often operates under other names and with less open aggression than it did in the past, it continues to function as an active consideration in a number of public policies, particularly within the medical system. As such, it is integral that we work to understand these histories, not just of the Nazi enemies who committed horrific atrocities, but of those atrocities done in our communities by our neighbors, our grandparents, and even our heroes. In understanding this past, we can recognize eugenics in our present and work to uproot it. Eugenic ideas about disability were and are formational ideas about what disability is and who is disabled. Chapter 3. Diagnosing people as problems. The medical model. The medical model is the primary paradigm through which disability is understood within mainstream society. While eugenics was obsessed almost entirely with the eradication of disabled people, the medical model pays attention not only to the elimination or reduction of disability but also to the source of disability. The medical model evolved with the advance of modern medicine and the decline in popularity of eugenics. The medical model posits that disability is a medical issue, a problem emerging from deviant anatomy. It is described by Stephen Smith as a model that associates being disabled with fixed essential characteristics, seen via the perspective of non-disabled people and experts, that necessarily prelude a life of personal loss or tragedy. Or, in the words of Eliot and Dreher, the medical model is a find-it and fix-it perspective. Health problems are diagnosed and specialized services are prescribed to cure the problem. The medical model is a clinical approach to disability which focuses on the use of diagnostic tools to identify pathology and make interventions in that pathology in order to cure or minimize it. Under this framework, disability is based in the body, normal is constructed as ideal, disabled people are dependent, and our identities are tragedies in need of intervention. The medical model is defined and controlled by actors in the medical industrial complex, doctors, medical researchers, pharmaceutical corporations, insurance corporations, hospitals, and others involved in the medical industry. These are the experts on disability within the medical model and, consequently, on disabled bodies and minds. Autism, spinal cord injury, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and muscular dystrophy are just some of the disabilities defined under the medical model. They are all interpreted through their medical diagnoses by medical experts. While being the primary model used to understand and define disability, there is no single definition of disability under the medical model. For instance, Black's Medical Dictionary defines disability as an observable mental or physical loss or impairment which is measurable and which may be permanent or temporary. The Bantam Medical Dictionary uses 31. 32 / loss or restriction of functional ability or activity as a result of impairment of the body or mind as the definition of disability. The Miller-Keane Encyclopedia and Dictionary of Medicine, Nursing and Applied Health defines disability as an impairment of function to below the maximal level, either physically or mentally, and anything that causes such impairment. And Mosby's Medical Dictionary defines disability as the loss, absence, or impairment of physical or mental fitness. These four dictionaries all define disability differently. Specifically, Blacks and Afospis define disability as an impairment, Bantam interprets disability as being caused by impairment, and Miller-Keane understands disability to be both, or either, an impairment or caused by an impairment, which is defined as a decrease in strength or value, abnormality of, partial or complete loss of, or loss of the function of, a body part, organ, or system. Interestingly, in defining disability in terms of the presence of an impairment of function to below the maximal level, Miller-Keane defines all functionalities that are not at the highest possible level as disabilities. To complicate things further, Blacks fails to define impairment. While the medical model has hegemonic control over the definition of disability, it does not actually uphold a universal definition of disability itself. Rather, disability shifts, even within this model, depending on social phenomena. Medicalization. The medical model approach is expressed in rigorous and rigid scientific terms, however, it remains unable to apply a fixed definition of disability. This is likely due, in part, to the fact that, as Peter Conrad points out in the Medicalization OJ Society, there is no universally accepted definition of health. Disability is commonly perceived as a lack of health and/or functioning. These definitions are in flux. This is the case, at least in part, because what is considered disabled and/or what is considered healthy changes as social factors and norms change. When a shift occurs in the social definition of health, new categories of disability can be created. This process is called medicalization. The term medicalization refers to two interrelated processes. First, certain behaviors or conditions are given medical meaning, that is, defined in terms of health and illness. Second, medical practice becomes a vehicle for eliminating or controlling problematic experiences that are defined as deviant, for the purpose of securing adherence to social norms. Medicalization can occur on various levels, conceptually, when a medical vocabulary is used to define a problem. 33. Institutionally, when physicians legitimate a program or a problem, or on the level of doctor-patient interaction, when actual diagnosis of a problem occurs. A good example of medicalization is childbirth. This was once commonly done at home and overseen by midwives, and it is now commonly done in hospitals and overseen by doctors. Conrad provides further examples of recent medicalization. Certain problems and conditions moved into the medical sphere during the previous century. These problems include mental illness, alcoholism, opiate addiction, childbirth, child abuse, and hyperactivity in children. Moreover, before the 1960s, categories such as attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anorexia, fibromyalgia, premenstrual syndrome, and Alzheimer's disease were either esoteric diagnoses or not yet described in the medical literature. Menopause only began being medicalized in the 1930s. And, while the medical team for bad breath halitosis previously existed, it only became a commonly regarded condition with the invention, and advertising of, Listerine in the 1920s. Both of these states of being have had medical meaning imposed upon them. Medicalization is a key component of the medical model because it is the vehicle to move something that wasn't previously considered a disability under the medical model to something that is. Published in 1952, the first diagnostic and statistical manual, the book used by psychiatrists in Canada and the United States to diagnose psychiatric disabilities, contained approximately 100 psychiatric diagnoses. 3 more editions, and 50 years later, the DSM now contains about 300 conditions. As the psychiatric sphere expands outward, argues Conrad, so too does the sphere of treatment. Problems that a decade or two ago would not have been deemed appropriate for medication are now managed with psychotropics, even apparently sometimes without any mental health diagnosis. This clearly indicates a greater implementation of medicalized solutions for human populations. This trend is likely to continue as more and more pharmaceutical medications are developed. Another example of a recently discovered/invented medical condition is 34/ excited delirium, which was first reported in 1982 in Seattle. According to exciteddelirium.org, excited delirium is a brain disorder that frequently, but not necessarily, involves the use of street drugs. A risk of the condition is that it may result in death while in police custody. Interestingly, the condition does not seem to inherently lead to death. Rather, it is only fatal if the police use violent force and restraints on a captive person. Does this condition exist to describe the excited states of drug users and psychiatrized people, or is it a diagnosis used to explain the deaths of these vulnerable populations at the hands of police? There are fundamental problems with both processes of medicalization. Diagnoses can have devastating consequences on people, leading to forced drugging, incarceration, surgeries, dehumanization, discrimination, and stigma. The act of medicalizing, of establishing all or part of an individual or group as being within the medical domain, is never neutral. It is an expression of the values and needs of those with power. This power is often used to control deviance from what is considered normal. To be sure, some of this medicalization is relatively harmless, like the popularization of the diagnoses of halitosis. However, medicalization frequently brings a host of consequences onto the medicalized individual. Medicalization works to identify NEW categories of deviance from the norm, and as new disabilities are created and disability is individualized, the social phenomena involved in the process of medicalization are erased. Experts, the creation of knowledge and the maintenance of oppression. The medical model does not account for systemic discrimination, or physical, social, linguistic or other barriers. Neglecting to incorporate these issues within the medical analysis actually works to perpetuate discrimination and barriers. Morse has written of a propensity in the medical establishment that reduces socially induced afflictions to individual-centered pathologies subject to cure with the aid of scientific advanced technology. As such, medicine is conveniently located to decontextualize social problems and to legitimize them. This is why Zola, one of the bedrock theorists of disability studies, has said that medicine is becoming a major institution of social control, nudging aside, if not incorporating, the more traditional institutions of religion and law. According to Zola, would cost more than $1 million for each child who might 51. Otherwise develop the condition. Screening would cost $5 million for every case of spinal muscular atrophy and so $6 million for every case of Fragile X syndrome. Population screening for SMA was not recommended because it was not considered to be cost-effective. However, it was recommended for Fragile X syndrome, the most common cause of genetic intellectual disability, because it would save roughly $34,102 for every prevented birth. While these are American studies, when screening programs are implemented in Canada, assuming costs similar to those in the US, the public health care system spends hundreds of thousands, even millions, of dollars to prevent the birth of a single disabled person. Further, the costs that are measured in cost-benefit analyses are priced in a disablist world. For instance, the SMA study factored in the cost of home renovation to make the home physically accessible for a disabled child. If there weren't physical, social, and structural barriers for disabled people, these costs would be dramatically reduced, even eliminated, in some cases. Even by genetic evolutionary logic, it does not make sense to eliminate specific genes and specific populations of disabled people without fully understanding the genetic implications. It is generally accepted that genes exist for a reason. Genes that have remained in a population are generally considered to have had some significant use. For example, carrier genes for sickle cell anemia result in a stronger resistance to malaria, while cystic fibrosis is believed to provide some resistance to tuberculosis. Type 1 diabetes provides resistance to hypothermia, and hemochromatosis, a genetic iron deficiency, is believed to help resist the plague. Dick Sobsey, a disability researcher, argues, placing a negative value on these without understanding their natural role may be extremely dangerous. Working to eliminate human genetic diversity means that we are working to eliminate the diversity that could ultimately help protect the human race from pandemic viruses, bacteria, or devastating environmental changes. Medical providers now have a legal responsibility to seek out what they consider to be fetal defects and notify pregnant women if a so-called defect is found. Doctors can be sued for misinterpreting test results or failing to notify a pregnant woman of a potential health condition in her unborn child. Likewise, genetic counselors can be sued for wrongful birth for failing to advise prospective parents of the genetic risks of having a child. Fertility clinics can also be sued if the resulting child is disabled. These lawsuits, according to Liddington v. Burns 52/ are not about medical practitioners causing injury or harm to the child, but whether that defendant's negligence was the proximate cause of the parents being deprived of the option of avoiding a conception or making a choice to terminate the pregnancy. Similarly, the Supreme Court of Alabama ruled against medical professionals when a disabled child was born, stating that the parents of a genetically or congenitally defective child may maintain an action for its wrongful birth, to discover and inform them of the existence of fetal defects. In other words, one could launch this type of lawsuit when a disabled child is born because the presumption is that disabled children should not necessarily be born and that medical practitioners have a duty to prevent these births. In Canada, these lawsuits appear to be less common. However, a British Columbia judge did order a doctor to pay one couple who had a child with Down syndrome $200,000 because they did not learn about the diagnosis in advance. This doctor's so-called negligence prevented the mother from accessing an abortion, which she would have done had she known about the diagnosis. Some courts have raised alarm bells about the eugenic nature of these types of lawsuits. One American court ruled in Taylor v. Karapati, the very phrase wrongful birth suggests that the birth of a disabled child was wrong and should have been prevented. The judge went on to say that if it was found that the birth of one defective child should have been prevented, it could also be argued that the births of classes of defective children should similarly be prevented, not just for the benefit of the parents but also for the benefit of society as a whole through the protection of the public welfare. This is the operating principle of eugenics. The court, in Grubbs v. Barberville Family Health Center, also warned that these kinds of lawsuits could be used punitively for not enacting eugenic practices by identifying and eliminating any disabled children in the womb. While these suits are used against practitioners within the medical industry, they use the medical model to give the legitimacy and ultimately work to reinforce the idea that disability is about odd individuals, deviant bodies, and tragedies that should be prevented at all costs. Of course, these costs include the complete undervaluing of disabled people's lives and self-worth as well as, in many cases, their feelings of being desired and loved by their parents. Eugenics inside the medical model. Wrongful life and wrongful birth litigation is one of many places where the lines are blurry or non-existent between the medical model and eugenic model. 53. Prenatal testing has obvious eugenic implications, as can doctor-assisted suicide. ULIS is not simply a case of overlapping schools of thought, however. Eugenics formed the basis of genetics, and much of contemporary genetic science began as eugenic science. There are numerous examples of simple name changes in scientific journals and organizations where eugenics was replaced with genetics or another authoritative scientific word. For instance, the Artnas ESOJ Eugenics became the Annals of Human Genetics/1 The Eugenic News became the BW/Object/Science, the Eugenics Society became the Galton Foundation, and the Eugenical News became the Journal of Social Biology, and the Human Betterment League of North Carolina, which became the Human Genetics League of North Carolina. The Minnesota Eugenics Society became stagnant in the 1930s, but following the Society's founder Dr. Charles Fremont's death in 1938, the DITE Institute for the Promotion of Human Genetics was established at the University of Minnesota. Sheldon Reed, head of the DITE Institute, coined the term genetic counseling as he felt genetic hygiene sounded like a toiletry. When the Eugenic Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory closed, its files were given to the DITE Institute. Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory is now an important genetic research facility. As Edwin Black argues, American eugenic institutions rushed to change their names from eugenics to genetics. With its new identity, the remnant eugenics movement reinvented itself and helped establish the modern, enlightened human genetic revolution. Where there was no name change, there was still a foundation in eugenics for many genetic organizations and publications. All of the founding editors of Genetics, a scientific journal founded in 1916, were proponents of eugenics. This journal continues to operate today. A number of Genet-ICS textbooks contained eugenics material. For example, Edmund Sinnott and L.C. Dunn wrote in the Principles of Genetics that even under the most favorable surroundings there would still be a great many individuals who are always on the borderline of self-supporting existence and whose contribution to society is so small that the elimination of their stock would be beneficial. These kinds of eugenic mentalities existed long after World War I. In his 54/1971 presidential address to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, geneticist Bentley Glass declared that no parents will in that future time have a right to burden society with a malformed or a mentally incompetent child. Eugenics didn't vanish, it became embedded in components of the medical model, and how that model defines and relates to disability is heavily influenced by its eugenic roots. Many personal traits and behaviors have been attributed to genetics in part or entirely. These components of human diversity are being, have been, or could be marked as disabilities and targeted for elimination. Such behaviors include shyness, religiosity, conformity, creativity, novelty-seeking and mental weakness, as well as polygamy, criminality, addiction, and overeating. Perhaps most dangerously, genetics has been used to explain oppression. Genes have been attributed to xenophobia, male dominance, and men raping women. Some white scientists use genetics to try to legitimize racism, arguing that black people are inherently less intelligent. Like eugenicists, actors within the medical industrial complex seek to label undesirable people as disabled and unwanted personalities or behaviors as disabilities. Conclusion: whether or not the medical model manifests itself in eugenic ways, it remains highly problematic. This model establishes certain kinds of bodies and behaviors, and certain lands of people, as acceptable or deviant, and seeks to eliminate those that do not fit within its classifications of normal. These classifications are created with little or no consultation with those of us who are considered disabled because we are not considered to be the experts about our own lives. The consequences for falling outside of norm can be devastating: institutionalization, abuse, poverty, loss of autonomy, dehumanization, and eradication. The medical model individualizes disability, roots it in the body, and seeks to cure or reduce it. Some of the consequences of the medical model for disabled people have been the erasure of the oppressive factors leading to the labeling and maintaining of disability, a minimization or marginalization of our own knowledge about our experiences, the inability to access appropriate medical care, abuse, confinement, and even death. High medical model has acted as an oppressive force on the lives of disabled people. This is why many disabled people are calling for its elimination. Rejecting the medical model, however, does not necessitate a rejection. 55. Of medicine or medical care. It would constitute a rejection of the tyranny of the norm and require the economic incentives and industry growth elements of the expansion of medical diagnoses and interventions to be scrutinized. Imagine what the world would be like if the resources that were devoted to eliminating disabled people were devoted to assisting disabled people and building strong communities. Imagine what medicine would look like if neither medicalization nor the medical gaze existed. There has to be a way to provide care without demonizing disability and, therefore, disabled people. Only by working to undo the medical model and by replacing it with disability models that focus on social justice and come from the bottom up from disabled and other marginalized people will we ever be able to achieve these changes. Chapter 4. The Charity Model. Like the two models already discussed, the charity model is based on the notion of inequality between those who are identified as disabled and those who are not. This framework accepts and reinforces the medical model, particularly the notion that disability is located in individual minds and bodies and that it can and, where possible, should be cured. Like the previous models, the charity model is an understanding of disability developed by people who are not disabled themselves but have tremendous power and resources and act in their own interests when constructing and employing this model. In the Middle Ages, the Christian formulation of disability was established for the purposes of bestowing charity. Disabled people were considered the deserving poor and received alms. Here others, including the children of the disabled, were denied charity or forced to do work in order to receive it. In the 15th and 16th centuries, disabled people played a very important role in society. In Crooks and Paupers, Bronislaw Jeremek writes, "When they are not able-bodied and are incapable of work, they offer the rich the possibility of acting on their charitable feelings and thus win salvation." So, charity bestowed on the disabled was a relatively quick and simple way for the rich to ensure access to heaven. However, during this period, who was considered disabled was not necessarily rooted in people's bodies or minds. In A History of Disability, Henry Jacques Steker argues that the lines between disability and marginality were problematic to distinguish. Many people who would be considered to have intellectual disabilities today would not have been considered disabled during the Middle Ages. Classifications of disability were not clear or exact and were closely linked to people's capacity to work. Charity was limited to people who were unable to work due to a perceived physical, intellectual, or psychiatric abnormality. Steker, observing the Middle Age Christian model of divine intervention, writes, "God sends us disease and disability as trials on the one hand, as opportunities to exercise our greatest virtue, charity, on the other, and thirdly as the sign of His presence. Disability, both useful. 57. 58/ and necessary, was as much, or more, about the person acting on the disabled body, the charitable person, as it was about the disabled person." During the eugenic period, charity was often discouraged because of the Malthusian belief that it would breed poverty and misery. With the decline of eugenics, however, the charity model regained its influence. The charity model is an authoritative paradigm today through which much of the imagery of disability is created. The charity model often accepts and reinforces medical model definitions of disability, but it adds a moral element to its understanding of disability. This model does not only base disabilities in individual bodies, it often presents those bodies as innocent victims of the tragic disabilities that they bear. Today, the idea that it is better to give than to receive remains a common assertion in the Western world. The charity paradigm constructs a notion of disability for the benefit of the giver, not for the disabled recipient. Additionally, charity works to construct social notions about disability by invoking images and ideas of disability and producing disabled recipients as the other. This is often complementary to and informed by the medical model. Like the medical model, the charity model has an industry dedicated to upholding and expanding it. Indeed, the actor in the charity model of disability is the charity industry itself, not disabled people. Charities may fail to improve or may negatively interfere in disabled people's lives in essentially two ways: through the allocation of resources and through the construction of disabled people's identities as individual and tragic, rather than social and positive. Charities, big money. Rather than advocating for change, the charity model and the charity industry are typically invested in the status quo. As disability is an individual tragedy, solutions are based on eliminating or reducing disability rather than addressing social barriers. Disability charities are big business. American charity revenues run into the billions, if not trillions of dollars a year. In Canada, with a much smaller population, disability-related charities are still very lucrative. 13 of the 25 highest-paid executives of charities in the United States in 2009 were from disability or health-related charities. Thai approach to disability taken by the majority of these organizations portrays the lives of disabled people as tragic and asks people to end their suffering by donating spare change or pledging money to find a cure. These organizations are innumerable, and many are familiar household names. According to Eli Clare, these groups support the quest for the cure to the exclusion of supporting independent living and civil rights for disabled people. Charity industry money rarely goes to helping to make our lives better. While some charities may spend money on wheelchairs, assistive devices, and other supports that people need, most charities do very little to meaningfully improve the lives of disabled people. By and large, disabled people live in poverty while billions of dollars are funneled into the charity system every year. These funds are generally not used to provide housing, food, attendant care, health care, or assistance devices to disabled people. Rather, the money largely goes to prevent the existence of future disabled people. The majority of the charities acting on behalf of disabled people are not led by disabled people. If they were, the funds they raise would likely be used in very different ways. Not only is finding the cure an offensive and wasteful endeavor for charities to pursue, but many disabled people do not want to be cured. Charities' first priorities are often themselves, and they spend large percentages of their revenue on fundraising and research, rather than direct support. The Canadian Cancer Society put 41% of its expenditures into 60/fundraising, 30% into research and prevention, and only 16% into support programs for people living with cancer. Cystic Fibrosis Canada put 45% of every dollar raised into research, 13% to administration, 10% to fundraising, and 19% to clinics and patient services. It appears that no money goes to support people living with cystic fibrosis outside of medical services. The Schizophrenia Society of Canada puts 22% of every dollar spent into human resources and administration and 14% into fundraising. No money raised by the SSC goes to support people diagnosed with schizophrenia, however, 5% goes to advocacy, which includes advocating for, among other things, employment, housing, and access to newer medications. According to Muscular Dystrophy Canada's 2010 annual report, the organization spends 47% of the money it brings in on fundraising, 15% on research, 12% on operations, and 24% on services for disabled people. These numbers, however, are somewhat misleading because 34% of all of Muscular Dystrophy Canada's revenue goes to compensation for staff /which would be interspersed throughout their other expenditures. All of these charities clearly prioritize themselves and/or research over supporting disabled people. Thai Ontario March of Dimes is the only disability charity I have researched that actually spends a great deal of its revenue on services for disabled people. The organization only spends 4% of its revenue on fundraising, and roughly 89% goes to support for disabled people. Much of these resources, no doubt, go to pay the Ontario March of Dimes' 1,577 employees. This particular charity, unlike its American counterpart, says that it turned its mission from cure to care decades ago. Thai simple fact that much of the funds raised by the Ontario March of Dimes goes to programming for disabled people, which is incredibly rare, does not mean that the charity is acting to benefit disabled people. There are critics of the Ontario March of Dimes programs. Ann Abbott is a disabled artist, activist, and blogger involved with cross-disability organization DAM and its anti-attend and care abuse campaign. Abbott has friends who have used Ontario March of Dimes independent living programs. The March of Dimes may be the best at allotting funds for people with disabilities and programs, but programs like their attendant care are run so badly, she says, that they can be abusive. Abbott argues, It's the type of care that they give that is awful. She includes DSAB list attitudes, paternalism, arbitrary restrictions, poor stall train. Lack of privacy, refusal to learn to communicate with some of the people they are providing services for, and threats of institutionalization if someone complains, as some of the problems with the programs. Independent living services make up roughly 43% of Ontario March of Dimes expenditures. The organization asserts, satisfaction with service remains high at 85-96. The March of Dimes in the United States spends 37% of its revenue on public and professional education, which largely focuses on eliminating disabled people. Its project to reduce birth defects has produced a video that says, babies born to overweight or obese moms have an increased risk of birth defects. THIRD is something that we would love to see women be able to prevent. This so-called public education implores women to take up a eugenic responsibility to help ensure that disabled children are not brought into the world. Another video produced by March of Dimes also has eugenic undertones. Done in the format of a reality show about getting women to eat well and exercise, Don't Abu Dare refers to the main character, a woman in her 20s, as Mama even though she has no children. It demonstrates the importance of vitamins, exercise, and healthy eating on health and repeatedly stresses reproductive health. It tells the audience, all women our age should take a multivitamin, make sure there is 400 micrograms of folic acid. This dosage of folic acid is recommended for women because it will prevent certain disabilities in a fetus if a woman gets pregnant, not because it is a necessary dosage for women. This subtly eugenic propaganda piece, done in the name of public education, uses disability charity dollars to pressure women to prevent disabled children. Charity and corporations. Within the charity framework, the overarching economic system is not problematized, but rather the individual's capacity to function within that system is. As such, capitalism is not problematic. Indeed, the charity model provides space for a softer side of capitalism. The Christian notion of salvation for the rich through charity has been modernized through corporate use of charity to simultaneously soften the blows of capitalism and grant economic salvation through increased market share and tax breaks. Corporate donations have become a mainstay on the charity circuit, particularly with the famed telethon. The most renowned telethon, which began in 1952 with host Jerry Lewis, is for the Muscular Dystrophy Association. In 1966 Jerry Lewis and the MDA telethon went national. These day-long spectacles, part variety show, part com. 62/commercial, are incredibly expensive undertakings. The 2009 MDA telethon cost over $193 million to produce and brought in $45.6 million, making expenses 42% of total revenue. The story of the MDA telethon, a telethon that I watched many times in my youth, remains relatively similar from year to year. Jerry Lewis tells some jokes, musicians, dancers and other acts perform, and in between we hear of the tragedy that is muscular dystrophy. Some of this we are told by the host, but some we are shown through the sad eyes of the children who are trotted out. Across the telethon stage, we are told about these children, their sad lives, the hopes that they have that may never be realized, and how they might die terribly young. Corporate CEOs come out periodically to announce how much money they have raised, giving them a chance to appear as down-to-earth, regular folks. These moments are great public relations opportunities for corporations, but in reality the companies frequently don't actually raise the money themselves. Each time someone makes a donation and signs a shamrock or paper egg for Shamrocks Against Dystrophy or the Paper Egg for Easter Seals campaign, or every time a worker wears jeans for the United Way, the money gets paid to the corporation as a donation. Then, the corporation takes credit for that donation. Paul K. Longmore, a disabled historian who has extensively researched the charity industry, writes about this process. Telethons could show that big companies cared about little people. Businesses of all sizes, but especially large corporations, could identify themselves with worthy causes, community needs and family values. They could link themselves in the public mind to those positive concepts by generating donations from their customers and employees and then offering the donations to those companies. As such, the corporation benefits substantially from charity donations. When businesses participate in charity drives, they can generate new customers because people come into the store to donate. Local newspapers run articles that are free publicity. A Regina Leader Post article informs readers they can buy an egg to help send a kid to camp by buying their paper eggs for $1 each from its national supporters, Money Mart, and the Bargain Shop, and from its regional sponsors like PV Mart, Sarkin Recycling Centers, Max Convenience Stores and the Conexus Credit Union. Or, when consumers go to the till, they may be asked if they would like to make a donation for a specific charity. As customers make their purchases, they may feel good because the corporation is supporting charity, which increases their positive feelings about /63. That company. Canada Safeway practices this for a number of disability charities: Muscular Dystrophy Canada, Easter Seals, Prostate Cancer Canada, the Canadian Breast Cancer Foundation and the Special Olympics. While Canada Safeway gets to take credit for raising millions, it only actually donates about 7% of that amount. Cause-related marketing, or charity work, has become, in the words of P. Rajan Vardarajan and Anil Menon, a way for a company to do well by doing good. This is why corporations put so much effort into telling consumers about all the charity work that they do. In fact, the amount that a corporation spends on advertising telling people it is giving to charity can even exceed the amount that it actually donates to charity. Unfortunately, records of advertising expenditures are difficult to obtain, but there are a few examples. General Mills spent $7 million in advertising and coupon printing to inform its customers that it donated $1 million to the MDA. Philip Morris extensively advertised its charitable contributions, some of which went to light hunger for people with AIDS in 1999. IHE Tobacco Company donated $60 to $75 million to charities and spent $100 million advertising its contributions. In 2006, a number of corporations including Apple, Motorola, and Gap launched Project Red. Each corporation would donate a percentage of the sales of particular Red products to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. These percentages varied from about 8% to 50%. About a year after the project had been launched, Maya Fraser, writing in Advertising Age, reported that Red had only raised $18 million, but its main corporate licensees had spent as much as $100 million on advertising. Red argued that the report was false and that the corporations had only spent twice as much on advertising than they had raised. No matter what, advertising the good work of these corporations far outstripped what they actually donated. All of these corporations acted not out of the goodness of their hearts in participating in cause-related marketing schemes, but out of the pursuit of growing profits. Seeking exposure and increased sales is why some companies have bought, through sponsorship, the names of charity fundraisers like the CIBC Run for the Cure, the American Airlines Celebrity Ski for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, the Scotiabank AIDS Walk for FIFE and the Avon Walk for Breast Cancer. Charity support has become a business strategy. As marketing consultant Carol Cohn put it, now, the question about charity is, can it support corporate business? The money that businesses can make from charity has become a marketing 64/ strategy both for those businesses and for the charities themselves. Budweiser encouraged bars to get involved with its charity fundraising, assuring them that nothing beats the volume or the profit you 11 enjoy with the Bud family of beers. So talk to your distributor about shamrocking for MDA and get ready to roll in the green. The Canadian Cancer Society heralds the bottom-line benefits of giving to the organization with such catchphrases as enhance your co-IP, orate image / build brand value / increase sales and stand apart from the competition. Charities also act as public relations vehicles to soften corporations' images to the public. Charitable contributions or campaigns to support disability-related charities can help heal damaged public images when corporations have received bad publicity. Kirk Davidson documented how the alcohol industry gives large sums of money to disability charities. He argues that this is an intentional ploy to transfer blame away from the physical and social damage that alcohol can cause. Additionally, Sears Canada was a corporate sponsor of children's cancer charities while it had 500 workers locked out of a warehouse. American Airlines, which received $7.1 million in fines in 2008 for safety and other violations and experienced increased FAA oversight following 3 landing incidents, was an outstanding corporate partner for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and a member of the Susan G. Komen for the Cure $1 Million Council elite. Roche, a pharmaceutical corporation and one of multinational Monitor's 10 worst corporations of 2008 for withholding AIDS medications from poor people and countries that attempted to cap the price, sponsored camps for disabled children as well as the International Roche Walk for Children. The Bank of America received a $20 billion bailout and had $100 billion protected losses in 2009 while it guaranteed a minimum of $1.95 million and a maximum of $2.7 million to Komen for the cure. Each of the above corporations has been accused of doing awful things such as mistreating workers, damaging the economy, endangering safety, and endangering lives, and each gives money to disability-related charities with the intention and effect of improving its public image. Liger-Stoll argues, the practice of cause marketing suggests that businesses may leverage the existence of dire social problems to improve their public images and profits while distracting attention from their connections as to why these social problems continue to exist. Corporations participate in causing social problems, then exploit those problems as marketing opportunities. Disability-related charities not only assist corporations in creating the illusion of good work / they also work to help uphold the capitalist system / 65 itself. Charities help to lighten the blows of capitalism by redistributing some resources, apparently in the direction of correcting society's shortfalls. While charities support those who are the so-called deserving poor, the tacit assertion is that the undeserving poor are without assistance by their own fault. That is to say, they are not victims of an unjust capitalist system. Thus, corporations, charities, medical researchers, accountants, performers and telethon hosts all benefit from this arrangement. Whether or not disabled people benefit is not particularly important within the charity paradigm. Because the charity model is more about the giver than the receiver, corporations also give consumers the opportunity to be givers and to feel good without actually having to do something that they would not have otherwise done. Berglund and Nakata suggest that this type of marketing is substituting consumption for morality. Additionally, marketing professor Michael Strahilowitz writes how the charity paradigm assuages the guilt of the consumer. By linking small donations to the purchase of products, marketers can give consumers an opportunity to feel good about making a contribution, without feeling bad that they are not giving more. Indeed, because the amount to be donated is determined by the seller of the product rather than by the buyer, the consumer is not likely to feel accountable for the amount contributed, only for the fact that a charity-linked product has been purchased. Therefore, one can feel the joy of giving even when, in reality, one may have given as low as 0.05% of the profits from that product to charity. Indeed, almost all consumers, including accountants, overestimate the amount of the donation when it is presented as a percentage of the profits from a product. Further, some of these types of marketing campaigns are intentionally misleading. Many corporations profit in concrete and quantifiable terms from their attachment to a charity. Research shows that product sales and market share increase if a donation is given to a charity. A corporation can increase both its sales and its profits if it donates even a small, inconsequential percentage of profits to charity. Along with the profit increase, a corporation can then attend a telethon or run ads and boast to a national or international audience about the supposed good work it has done, simultaneously receiving free publicity and, depending on the type of donation, a tax credit. 66. Disabled people, the product of charity. The product that disability, medical, and health charities peddle is disabled people. In order to create the most marketable product, charities construct disabled people in three important ways: as children, as white, and as objects to be pitted. As an experiment, think for a moment about the advertisements for disability organizations that you have seen or heard. Now try to remember how many of them did not involve white children. I conducted an informal study of hundreds of advertisements for charities, and almost all of them prominently featured white children. Child is an important advertising tool for charities. Some of them even have official poster children. They sell the image of helping innocent victims and the potential future of promise rather than suffering. The story goes like this: the child depicted could be an astronaut or an athlete if only they could be given the cure that you, the consumer, could make possible. A pair of advertisements by the Huntington Society of Canada illustrates this cliché. One features a photograph of a girl in a ballerina outfit, while the other shows a boy in an orange jumpsuit holding a rocket. Both children are standing in the front of the classroom, as if at show and tell. Chalkboard above the first child reads, "When I grow up, my mind and body will slowly deteriorate until I choke to death trying to swallow," and the other says, "When I grow up, I will be racked by spasms so severe, I'll burn 5,000 calories a day." Children, unlike disabled adults, do not have spoiled futures. Children are not perceived as economic drains on society, rather, they are potential contributors whose economic identities as productive citizens can be realized. These advertisements tell us of the necessity to protect children's future aspirations or simply to protect their futures. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has mastered the use of children in its propaganda. One ad shows a blonde 7-year-old boy. Above him are the words of Brock Glover, an accomplished motocross racer and the child's father. Some parents dream about their kids growing up to be motorcycle champions. I just dream about my son getting a chance to grow up. Next text, from the cute, sad boy reads, "Please help my dad find a cure." The consumer is implored to make a donation to help this adorable, innocent child have a future. The ad does not mention that most kids with cystic fibrosis do grow up to become adults, with the mean age being 37.4 years old. Children are even used in charity promotions for diseases that they do not typically experience firsthand. For example, a CIBC Run for the Cure pamphlet/67 depicts 7 white girls in private school uniforms with a pink ribbon wrapped around them. Thai text below the image reads, "We're running for the future." These children compel us to save them by making a donation, even though they may never personally know someone who is affected by breast cancer. If consumers are not saving children from their dangerous futures, they are saving them from their families. Thai MetLife Foundation says in one of their advertisements that you'd be surprised how early the effects of Alzheimer's can set in. Below this text, and the close-up photo of a child, we are informed that Alzheimer's disease steals normal life from caregivers, spouses, children, and grandchildren alike. While disabled people are frequently represented as children, they are perhaps more commonly depicted as white. When there are people of color in photographs, they are almost always in groups that also include white people. Racialized communities in Canada and the United States are labeled as disabled disproportionately compared to white people. Further, the vast majority of disabled people live in the global south. Yet the image portrayed by the charity industry is very much that of the North American white disabled person. Why? Thai first obvious answer is racism, which pervades all sectors of society. Thai kind of racism at play here has a particular economic incentive. Charity advertisements are about maximizing fundraising through the construction of a white disabled person, whom white people will more likely pity, as a ploy to generate more money. The underrepresentation of racialized people in charity advertising corresponds to the underrepresentation of the same groups in advertising generally. People of color are rarely portrayed in commercial advertising, and when they are usually not alone or the primary character. The absence of racialized people in advertising reflects the systemic racial bias of the media. Of course, some racialized people are the central focus of charity advertising. For example, a multiple sclerosis society ad in Britain from the late 1990s depicts a black man on his knees with his body stretched over them, hands open and resting on the floor. The man has the arm of a white person around him, supporting him. Thai text of the advertisement reads, "Multiple sclerosis is still incurable. Without us, it always will be." Thus, the representation of racialized disabled people reinforces and strengthens a strange hybrid of an ethic of care intertwined with the idea of the white man's burden of the last century, where white people named themselves the saviors of racialized people and better able to rule their societies than the indigenous inhabitants themselves. This representation is also closely linked with interventionist politics at the international level, where Western imperial 68/ism is guided by the principles of aid and keeping the peace. Through this ad, whiteness and ability are understood as integral to the survival of racialized disabled people. Generalized racism in the media manifests in particularly troubling ways with respect to charity advertising. While North American charities for North American children almost always use young, white children, there are charities that exclusively depict black children in their advertising. You have seen these ads: small black children with wide, vacant eyes and distended bellies, sometimes with flies on them, sometimes in bed staring at the camera. These children, disabled because of their hunger and lack of health care, implore the North American viewer to give their pity and money. These children, argues Acua Benjamin, are overwhelmingly presented not as sweet, cheerful, and brave, like the brave white disabled children for charities in North America. Rather, they are depicted as overwhelmingly destitute, overwhelmingly needy, and so they are presented in terms of a trope, about deserving the charity of whites, deserving of charity or pity of us living in the North, deserving our charitable goodwill. Tin's depiction of disability is very different than that of the white disabled child, whose innocence and purity is on the forefront, rather than her savagery. Pity is marketed to us at the expense of the many complexities that exist about disability and the many truths that define what it means to be disabled. Pity is sold to us because pity sells better. For example, when protesters criticized the MDA's representation of disabled people as pitiful, spokesperson Jerry Lewis said, "If it's pity, we'll get some money." Pity. You don't want to be pitied for being a cripple in a wheelchair? Stay in your house. In order to sell us tragedy, the charity industry constructs visual cues about what it looks like to have an intellectual or psychiatric disability label. The look, or the construction of the physical traits of intellectual and psychiatric disability, is necessary in order to evoke emotional responses in consumers. As such, both groups have a number of similarities: sad eyes with vacant stares, scruffy hair and a disheveled general appearance. These people are usually photographed alone. Intellectual disabilities, however, have an additional physicality when presented in charity advertising. Some genetic conditions, such as Down syndrome, do have physical characteristics that correspond with them. Yet, there is no definitive way to tell by looking whether a person has an intellectual disability. Charity advertising, however, has constructed the idea of what intellectual disability looks like for marketing purposes. Caroline Ers and Nick/69. Ellis found that a number of charity advertisements relied either on the characteristic features of Down syndrome or rather vacant-looking people photographed in an unsympathetic way. While this study is quite old, it would appear that the same visual clichés are still relied upon by the charity industry. In 3 recent advertisements for the Special Olympics, advertising agency Grey Group Canada shows a single white person in each ad. 2 of the people in the ads, a young man and a young woman, appear to have Down syndrome. The older man in the third ad does not. These 3 people all look unhappy and are staring vacantly at the camera. These images are overlit and are not full of the dark shadows common in advertisements depicting intellectually disabled people. The photos are unflattering and look like they could be mug shots, driver's license photos or pictures out of a medical textbook. Each ad depicts an individual's head and torso in two images. The image on the left shows the person from the front and the image on the right shows the person from the back. Three people are similarly posed with similar white t-shirts on. The ad with the young man is wearing a t-shirt that says, "Think I'm slow," on the front. The back of his shirt says, "Let's race." The other two people are wearing similarly messaged t-shirts. At the bottom of each ad, in very small print, it says, "Help support Special Olympics and give people with intellectual disabilities the confidence to win at life." The positive messaging of the ads is overwhelmed by the imagery and makes up only a tiny fraction of the ads. Advertisements like these are some of the ways that charities have constructed a visually identifiable intellectually disabled person who is instantly recognizable as an object of pity. Overcoming disability, supercrips, and the able-disabled occasionally, what at first glance appears to be the opposite of a pity object becomes a marketable representation of disability. The 1s up air RIP-S supercrips are also called the able-disabled. Tanya Tichkowski writes, "The able-disabled are those people who can exclude attending to disability by attending fully to their ability to participate in society, as normally as is possible, and they ultimately and inevitably signify having a positive effect on others, contributing fully to the community, and maximizing their potential." The stories of the able-disabled demonstrate that even disabled people are able to fit in and take up an appearance which shows that their conduct is undoubtedly oriented to an unquestioned normalcy. Through this way of conceptualizing 70/disability, disability becomes the space in which the value of normal shines forth without ever having to be directly spoken of, and disabled people are held to be asserting their individual ability when they can be seen as oriented to serving this normal order. Supercrips are not necessarily special for their actions, rather, they are special because of the emotional response or the feeling of inspiration they can elicit in others. Often, supercrips do nothing special at all. Instead, writes disabled activist Eli Clare, these stories rely upon the perception that disability and achievement contradict each other and that any disabled person who overcomes this contradiction is heroic. Everyone knows the characteristics of the supercrip: determined, motivated and, above all, inspirational. As disabled historian Paul K. Longmore reminds us, we have all seen it incarnated by disabled heroes on television, those plucky overcomers who supposedly inspire us with their refusal to let their disabilities limit them. Supercrips are inspirational because they do normal things. Like millions of people, and most children, supercrips play childhood sports. Adam Bender played a number of sports on his crutches, making him one of P-Opfe magazine's bravest kids. The magazine also said that 9-year-old Adam had courage to spare because he played sports. Disabled people are exceptional for being employed, like Bill Porter, who has cerebral palsy and lived as an unsuspecting hero because he took on the job of a door-to-door salesman. Disabled people are gutsy when they dance, like amputee Heather Mills. Upon her first appearance on Dancing with the Stars, she was called an inspiration by one judge and was told, "You've got more guts than Rambo," by another. When Time magazine wrote about an extraordinary couple, they both have black belts in martial arts, one plays multiple instruments and the other is a public speaker. One might think that their eclectic achievements would be the stoi. Instead, the story's raison d'etre was the remarkable fact that they both had Down syndrome and they were getting married. The fact that these two disabled people found someone else to love them was the reason for the article and their supercriptum. Of course, sometimes it is actually the extraordinary achievements of people that garners them their supercrip status. Rick Hansen, who pushed his wheelchair across 34 countries, in his Man in Motion World Tour in order to raise money to find a cure for spinal cord injuries, is an example of this type of supercrip. While Hansen, like Terry Fox, Franklin D. Roosevelt and many others, worked very hard for this status, it remains out of their control. Supercrip status whether /71. It is granted because you get married, have a job, play sports, will around the world or become president. Can be revoked at any time if those with power so choose. Further, while it would appear that super crips are the only disabled people who do not evoke pity, this is not actually the case. The super crip is constructed on top of pity. These achievers are useful not because they have achieved, but because they have done so in spite of their disabilities. Super crips are not inherently inspirational, they are inspirational because they are objects of pity, though that pity is transformed into inspiration. Charities help construct the super rip to promise us what is possible if we simply make a donation. They show people overcoming their disabilities and send a message that disabled people can achieve with your donation. Tori Boyles is a young, white girl featured in an Easter Seals video. The video shows a girl who has come leaps and bounds from doctor's prognosis. According to one Easter Seals staff person, you can envision what she was like 7 years ago. Tori is presented as a determined, sweet child who, in the words of her mother, never gives up. She is a super crip for having defied doctors' expectations by walking and talking and is inspiring to others for having overcome so much. Tori's story is told in this fundraising video to show consumers the successes of Easter Seals programming. Chuck Graham, a U.S. Senator featured in the video, says, "I hope that Tori, through her involvement with Easter Seals, is able to have access to all of the therapies and equipment she needs to become the woman that I know she can become." The senator, who is also disabled, presents Tori as a once lost child who has been found through the Easter Seals' assistance in helping her walk and talk. But, unless you donate, she may not be able to become even more of a super crip and her potential as a productive citizen could be lost forever. The super crip does not just uncover her own potential, however, she also acts to unmask the remarkable untapped potential of every non-disabled person. The hopeful reaction of the non-disabled person to a super crip is intended to trigger a donation because of the self-realization that this disabled person causes in the non-disabled person. This is the realization that the non-disabled person can do so much more, particularly if a disabled person can achieve such remarkable feats. As a super crip, the disabled person receives reverence rather than respect and often gains access to the rights that should have been theirs all along. Overcoming disability, while it may come with the consequences of loss of dignity, individuality, and/or respect, is beneficial to disabled people in a disablest society. Of course, the lives of disabled people run the gamut, like everyone. 72/ Between normal, extraordinary, monotonous, bizarre, dull, eccentric, fantastic, boring, and everything in between. Our lives are not constrained to the aspirations of being disabled or to pity and inadequacy. Our motives and ambitions are not dictated by this dichotomy. However, the charity industry constructs disabled lives in this way rather than depicting our lives as the beautiful, diverse, difficult, rewarding lives that they are. While the super crip and the infantilized, white, pitiful disabled person are problematic and damaging sales pitches, the industry also markets false ideas about resistance and change. They tell us that only you can make the difference that is needed to help make disabled people's lives better. Segregated spaces, sheltered workshops, and summer camps. Two of the programs commonly funded by charity donations are segregated spaces, sheltered workshops, and summer camps that are frequently managed, supervised, or policed by non-disabled people. Sheltered workshops employ disabled people and have been described by the National Disability Rights Network, an American advocacy group for disabled people, as just another institution segregating people with disabilities away because of our unwillingness to accept that our perceived notions about their ability to work may be wrong one. These workplaces pay many workers less than minimum wage, are not bound by labor legislation, and often act as warehouses for disabled people. Many disabled workers in sheltered workshops are paid sub-minimum wage, sometimes less than $1 an hour. For example, one sheltered workshop paid its workers about $30 a month. Other shelters pay people only a few dollars a day, and one American sheltered workshop paid its workers only 8% of the minimum wage, while others make only 10%. Most workers in sheltered workshops earn half of the minimum wage. However, There are even some piecework programs that actually charge disabled people to work for them. These workplaces are often exempt from labor legislation because the work is understood to be rehabilitative, a point reflected in the ruling of an Ontario court case involving a Salvation Army workshop. If the substance of the relationship is one of rehabilitation, then the mischief which the Employment Standards Act has been designed to prevent is not present, and a finding that there is no employment/73 relationship must be made. This logic has been upheld in at least one provincial appellate court and has withstood the test of time. Where a working relationship is determined to be largely rehabilitative or therapeutic in nature, the jobs that disabled people have are not considered employment. This is the case no matter what those jobs are, how long the workers have been there, how much money the workshop makes, or any other factor. This evaluation is often justified by the assertion that disabled people in sheltered workshops will gain skills through those experiences and move into the general workforce. However, in the United States, a mere 3.5% of people a year actually move out of the sheltered workshop into paid employment. This is, in part, because sheltered workshops are businesses. Stephen Taylor, the director of the Center on Human Policy at Syracuse University, says, "Like any enterprise, workshops need to provide products of high quality to survive and continue to receive contracts. Workshops have a built-in incentive to retain the most productive and dependable clients. Workers who would, even by the workshop standards, be ready to move into an unsheltered workplace are kept at the workshops in order to increase their profit." I was, however, able to uncover one case of a sheltered workshop worker who was able to make it to the courts regarding a workplace accident. Frank Van Este had his finger chopped off in a saw at the sheltered workshop where he was employed. He and a previous manager had both reported that the saw was missing a safety guard. The workshop, which was run by the YWCA, said it didn't have the money to make the saw safe. The board president defended the lack of safety, saying that the workers, many of whom were intellectually disabled, had consented to work in unsafe conditions. The court found that Van Este was not a worker under the law. The court did, however, convict the workshop of one count on the safety issue but suspended the sentence. Ontario's Occupational Health and Safety Act continues to consider workers in a work project or rehabilitation program not to be workers. Sheltered workshops are more aptly called sweatshops. Sweatshops are workplaces that do not adhere to wage and labor regulations. Sheltered workshops do not meet minimum wage standards, and workers can be fired for doing things that would not warrant legal dismissal in a regulated workplace, one that isn't a segregated workplace for disabled people. These workplaces often don't provide full-time work. Indeed, 86%, 74% of sheltered workshop employees that make sub-minimum wages are underemployed. When there isn't work to be done, some workers are warehoused with little or no programming. Yet, when people working in sheltered workshops do move into other employment, their pay and benefits have been found to dramatically increase. Because these disabled workers aren't considered real workers, they cannot unionize either. In an attempt to unionize Goodwill in Southern California, the National Labor Relations Board found that only the non-disabled employees would be allowed to unionize. This was in spite of the fact that many of the disabled employees had worked there for years and used few of the so-called rehabilitative services. Charities that run or have run sheltered workshops include Easter Seals, Goodwill, YWCA and the Salvation Army, among others. This is some of the programming infrastructure and maintenance that charity dollars fund. One of the most common examples of charity programming is the summer camp. Many charities run summer camps for disabled children, the most well-known of which are perhaps the Muscular Dystrophy Association and the Easter Seals camps. Easter Seals camps have the motto "LA Place Where Nobody Stares." While these camps may have a positive or meaningful impact on the lives of disabled children, as any summer camp experience might, these charities construct segregated camp spaces for children, many of whom already attend segregated classrooms or schools. Rather than providing funding or advocacy to ensure that summer camps are accessible, disability charities construct separate camps for kids, providing a stare-less environment while reinforcing the notion that disabled children are different and legitimizing their separation from other children. THI camps are conducted with continued fundraising in mind. One Muscular Dystrophy Association camp alumni always wondered why MDA donors were taking pictures of us getting helped. She also referred to herself as a cute prop for the Harley-Davidson Motor Company when it attended an MDA camp to let campers sit on motorcycles or in sidecars while taking numerous photos of them for promotional material. Critics of these camps have seen a small victory with the recent decrease in segregated camps. But just because a few segregated camps are closing doesn't mean that disabled kids have more inclusive opportunities. In Ontario, Goodwin and Staples report that approximately 20% of 200 accredited camp administrators indicates they would like to have their camp name appear on an integrated camp list. This does not necessarily mean that they are fully or partially accessible, and even if they /75 are, only about 40 camps want to be considered inclusive in a province with a population with over 13 million people. There are, however, some disabled people who support segregated camps for disabled youth because they allow campers to develop relationships with other disabled people without the influence of non-disabled people. Erickson found going to camp to be a positive experience for this very reason. Because it wasn't put on by disabled people for disabled people, there was no attention paid to internalized disableism. We didn't know how to hang out with each other because we had internalized disableism. While there were relationships formed between campers in a way that was empowering, it was in spite of the structure of the camp. Certainly many disabled people benefit from spaces that are disabled people-only spaces, but these spaces have to be created with the intention of subverting internalization. Like other marginalized groups, disabled people can share experiences based on a common oppression when they are together. It is definitely my experience that I talk about my life very differently when I am with other disabled people. Fiona Campbell asserts that these spaces one can act as a sanctuary for healing internalized oppression. There is an important distinction between a space that disabled people create in the spirit of community building and belonging, and one that an organization that is led by non-disabled people creates for the good of disabled people. As Fiona Campbell reminds us, separation should not be confused with segregation. Segregation is imposed upon people, and the small amount of empowerment that may be gained out of those spaces cannot justify their oppressive nature. Internalization. Segregated spaces reinforce the idea that disabled people are different, unwanted, and unable to exist in the real world. One disabled people can internalize these ideas, resulting in feelings of inadequacy and insecurity. Further, images of the supercrip and the poor, pitiful, tragic disabled person not only impact public perception of disabled people, they negatively impact disabled people as well. Many disabled people internalize disableism in general, and these images in particular. If the only public portrayals of disabled people are those of the infantilized and the pathetic on one hand and the supercrip on the other, this inadequate binary becomes the only framework within which disabled people can interpret themselves. This can lead to disabled people having a skewed sense of themselves. 76/. One way that this can take place is through internalized disableism. This is a form of internalized oppression, which is defined by Penny Rosenwasser as an involuntary reaction to oppression which originates outside one's group and which results in group members loathing themselves, disliking others in their group, and blaming themselves for the oppression. Essentially, internalized oppression is exactly as it sounds, oppression turned inwards. Internalization works to undermine disabled people's positive identities and impose the identity of a disabled person as depicted by the medical and charity industries. As such, many disabled people feel compelled to aspire to supercriptum or to hide their disabilities. For instance, many blind people work hard to stop doing blindisms or habits that are specific to blind people and, therefore, things that remind sighted people that they are blind. Sarah Blake, a blind freelance writer, is the author of the article Beating Blindisms. In it, she addresses what some blindisms are and how to get people, primarily children, to stop doing them. Blake writes, "The biggest problem with eye pressing is that it is considered socially unacceptable. It is not something most people do, even though it is probably as normal for a blind person as biting one's nails is for anyone else. Blind people are taught by other blind people to feel shame in doing things that are normal for them and to stop doing them in pursuit of normality. People may also internalize problematic messages from specific charities. For example, the MDA frequently highlights children with forms of muscular dystrophy that are fatal. One person, who is now over 30 years old, with muscular dystrophy says, and into the community. The Berkeley SIL was revolutionary as a model for advocacy-based organizations. No longer would we tolerate being spoken for. Independent living activists work to establish centers for independent living across the United States and throughout the world. In Denver, Colorado, Wade Blank, a former reverend who had been an active supporter of the civil rights movement, began working in a nursing home in 1971. 4 years later, he was fired for suggesting that some of the residents be moved into apartments and be cared for there by the facility's orderlies. After losing his job, Blank helped 18 residents of the nursing home move out, and together they formed the Atlantis community. This group was the predecessor for ADAPT. After winning access to transit, ADAPT changed its name to American Disabled for Attendant Programs. Today it is one of the most well-known and successful disability rights organizations in the United States. Thai National Council on Independent Living was founded in 1982. Today there are hundreds of independent living centers in the United States and over 25 in Canada. The 1970s also saw an escalation of tactics by disability rights activists. Many of these tactics were taken in the United States to ensure the passage of the Rehabilitation Act, an important piece of disability rights legislation. Nixon vetoed the proposed law twice, once in 1972 and again in 1973. In 1972, a number of protests were held, including one in New York that included a sit-in on Madison Avenue. There was also a protest at the Lincoln Memorial, organized by Disabled in Action and Paralysed Veterans of America, who demanded a debate about disability issues during the 1972 presidential race. While many disability organizations at the time were divided based on medical diagnostic categories, disabled historian Paul Longmore claims that the attempts to have the act passed prodded disabled people to form political alliances across traditionally competitive disability categories. In effect, Nixon provided the nascent disability rights movement with a focus, a unifying target. Ultimately, Nixon signed the Rehabilitation Act in 1973. 84/. However, Sections 501 to 504 of the Rehabilitation Act were passed but not yet enacted. They were sitting on the books, unenforceable until the government chose to enact the necessary regulations. Sections 501 to 503 are related to prohibiting employment discrimination and require affirmative action. Section 504 ensured that disabled people would not be excluded from government-funded programs. No otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States, as defined in Section 7, shall, solely by reason of her or his disability, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance or under any program or activity conducted by any executive agency. This section was crucial to disability rights as, among other things, it would secure access to publicly funded education, including post-secondary schools and transportation. A group of 120 disabled protesters, many of whom had connections to the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, occupied a U.S. government building in San Francisco in April of 1977. Both the sections of the Rehabilitation Act and the Regulations for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act were signed on day 23 of the sit-in. However, the protesters remained at the sit-in for 2 days after the signing in order to be sure they had not been diluted. This landmark victory made it easier for disabled people to fight discrimination and showed the nation that disabled people not only could, but also would, fight back. The Rehabilitation Act, and the later Americas with Disabilities Act would likely never have been passed if not for the disability rights movement. Indeed, many of the gains that disabled people have made over the past 30 years around accessing direct funding for attendant care, moving disabled people back into their communities and access to education would likely never have been made if not for the disability rights movement. The disability rights movement in Canada. The far smaller, but still significant, disability rights movement in Canada has fought for, and won, legal recognition and rights for disabled people. In the 1970s almost all of the provinces had a disability organization, and the Coalition of Provincial Organizations of the Handicapped, which is known as the Council of Canadians with Disabilities today, was founded in 1976/85. Primarily a disability rights lobby, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, according to its website, seeks to achieve priorities through law reform, litigation, public education, and dialogue with key decision makers. One of the major victories of the CCD and other disability rights groups was gaining inclusion in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The first draft of the Charter did not include disabled people as a group of protected persons. After protests and campaigning, disabled people were added to the Charter. As such, governments are prohibited from discriminating against disabled people, and disabled people are granted equity rights. Charter inclusion also meant that people who had been disenfranchised because they were confined to institutions were now legally allowed to vote. The CCD has also waged a long-standing campaign to make public transportation accessible, working to change legislation and actively litigating against Via Rail and Air Canada. It has, in the words of former CCD Chairperson Jim Dirksen, been carving out values of inclusion, integration, and equality rights for disabled people in Canada. Also, members of the CCD were integral in the founding of Disabled People's International, which got its start in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in 1980. The Rehabilitation International Conference in Winnipeg resulted in a walkout of 200 to 300 disabled delegates who were upset over the lack of representation and leadership from disabled people. Henry Enns, a Winnipeg activist who would go on to be the head of DPI, spoke to disabled protesters, saying, "Do one hear you want to form your own international organization of disabled people?" These people created DPI, which remains one of the most important disability organizations today. Problems with rights-based approaches. Rights movements are, at their core, about accessing the privileges that a person would otherwise be able to access if they were not a member of an oppressed group. Rights models are reformist. Power is to be accessed, not unraveled. The disability rights movement in the United States began with the intention of gaining access to mainstream society. The movement was a largely straight, white, middle-class movement with a strong male leadership. These pioneers were struggling to have the right to access privileged forms of education and to be able to participate in and profit from the capitalist economy. While this movement did focus on ensuring the implementation of positive rights for disabled people, it was an add ramps and stir approach. Disability rights is not 86/ concerned with leaving other disabled people out because they are marginalized beyond just disability. With oppressive structures intact, rights will only ever take a particular group so far. As Marta Russell has pointed out, the market transgresses on nearly every liberal right. She goes on to critique how the American Disabilities Act has failed reduce the number of unemployed disabled people, calling the system a fixed game where disabled workers are at the bottom of the competitive labor market, and that labor market is, by design, structured to leave millions of workers underemployed and unemployed. Having a right to be free from employment discrimination does nothing to address the capitalist economic system, which requires unemployment to thrive and devalues workers. However, the rights model can be a pragmatic tool. Obviously, the Canadian and American disability rights movements have won important victories that have changed many disabled people's lives. The social model. In the United Kingdom, many, but not all, disabled activists took a different approach to political organizing. This approach, which was named the social model in 1983 by Mike Oliver, became internationally influential and fundamentally altered disability organizing and how many disabled people saw themselves. In 1976, in a response to frustrations about existing organizing in England, a group called the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation wrote the Fundamental Principles of Disability, which outlined its political platform. UPIAS defines impairment as lacking all or part of a limb, or having a defective limb, organism, or mechanism of the body. This definition has been expanded by most social theory advocates to include mental functioning, mental health, intellectual impairments, and sensory impairments. For UPIAS, disability is created by a society which disables physically impaired people. The organization's platform continues, disability is something imposed on top of our impairments by the way we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. Under the social model, disability is the oppression that people with impairments face. A common illustration of this point is if your impairment is not having legs, your disability is that you can't get in a building because there is a flight of stairs. The fundamental principles of disability stress the importance of disabled people's leadership and participation in disability organizations. The document, /87, and UPIAS, also criticized the demand for guaranteed income for disabled people, focusing instead on the importance of disabled people gaining access to paid employment. Benefits one which are not carefully related to the struggle for integrated employment and active social participation will constantly be used to justify our dependence and exclusion from the mainstream of life, the very opposite of what is intended. This is why the appeal to the state for legislation to implement a comprehensive, national disability income scheme is in reality nothing so much as a program to obtain and maintain in perpetuity the historical dependence of physically impaired people on charity. UPIA's focus on removing barriers to paid employment is due, in large part, to the Marxist roots of the organization, which put a major emphasis on the economy and labor. Another tenet of the social model is the idea that disability is not an illness because the model is about the construction of disability and, according to Oliver, there is no causal link between illness and disability. Oliver contends that the problem arises when doctors try to use their knowledge and skills to treat disability rather than illness. Disability as a long-term social state is not treatable medically and is certainly not curable. Under the social model, impairments may be caused by illnesses, and some ill people may be disabled, but disability is a social construct. The social model was a massively important development as it provided an entirely new way for disabled people to see themselves. It also provided disabled people with a point of commonality. As disability is the oppression that people face, under the social model, there was suddenly a community of disabled people rather than many different communities of people with specific impairments. Disabled people would not only come together when they had a common enemy, like Nixon, they were united together against disability and the social structures that imposed it. Disabled author Liz Crow described the importance of the social model by illustrating the sense of empowerment it has given to disabled people. For years now this social model of disability has enabled me to confront, survive, and even surmount countless situations of exclusion and discrimination. It has played a central role in promoting disabled people's individual self-worth, collective identity and political organization. One don't think it is an exaggeration to say that the social model has saved lives. 88/. The social model changed how disabled people saw themselves, each other and the world. For this reason, Francis Hassler called it the big idea. Michael Oliver, who claimed parental rights for the model, is the academic who fleshed out the UPIA's interpretation of disability. Oliver said, the social model was a way of getting us all to think about the things we had in common, and the barriers that we all faced within the grassroots of disability organizing. The social model gained widespread support. However, the established organizations that acted on behalf of disabled people, rather than with disabled people, were reluctant, even hostile, to the model. Initially, disability organizing took a different turn in England than in the US and Canada because of the differences between the social and rights models. The intention of the social model was not to build or support a rights movement. Vic Finkelstein, One of the original UPIA's members, said, "Civil rights are about individual people or groups of people. This is a legalistic approach to emancipation. Therefore the campaign for disability rights does not depend on, nor is it a reflection of, the social model of disability." Ignoring this contradiction, the disability rights movement in Canada and the United States has adopted the social model definition of impairment and disability and incorporated them into its organizing. The North American approach is largely a hybrid between the rights and social models. The social model definitions have been adopted by the disability rights movement, which has changed the discourse of the movement to some extent and created the space for much more cross-disability organizing. However, the bulk of North American disability organizing, in my experience, remains civic rights focused. The disability rights movements in Canada and the United States commonly adopt demands that are geared towards including disabled people in society and stop there. Typically, they do not work for a rebuilding of socio-economic systems, only for them to be rewritten, editing in disabled people as main characters. Finkelstein, on the other hand, said, "We cannot understand or deal with disability without dealing with the essential nature of society itself. To do this, disabled people must find ways of engaging in the class struggle." Very few, if any, disability organizations take this approach to organizing in Canada and the United States. While the impact of the social model cannot be underestimated, the valid relevance and representativeness of the model have been questioned. UPIA's was a democratic centralist organization that had a membership consisting of physically disabled people who were primarily living in institutions. This organization and those who championed the social model, most notably Michael Oliver, had a membership of mostly white men. Critiques of the social model. One of the main critiques of this model is its focus on paid labor. For instance, Carol Thomas asserted that the social model's priority of gaining access to the formal paid workforce excludes many disabled women and their often unpaid labor, including reproductive labor and housework. It also prioritizes certain kinds of help over attendant care to help women perform these gendered forms of labor. UPIA's fundamental principles also publicly attacked another disabled people's organization, Disablement Income Group, which was fighting for a guaranteed monthly amount of money for disabled people who were unable to work. The alternative to an incomes approach to the particular poverty in disability is to struggle for changes to the organization of society so that employment and full social participation are made accessible to all people, including those with physical impairments. This position is highly problematic on pragmatic grounds. While disabled people can work, in our disablist, capitalist economy, many disabled people do not work for a variety of reasons, including a lack of accommodation and systemic discrimination. Fighting for social change is essential, however, fighting for long-term change at the expense of people who are immediately trying to access basic needs is not only divisive, it is dangerous. Many disabled people living in the community are in a very vulnerable and precarious position as they are unable to secure adequate food and housing as a result of systemic discrimination and employment discrimination. These are the basic needs that people in DIG were trying to secure for themselves and others. It was problematic for UPIA's members and other proponents of the social model, whose food and shelter were likely not at risk, to publicly organize against these basic demands. It is possible to be anti-capitalist while advocating for social assistance improvements. Many organizations find the room to fight for long-term social change while fighting to deal with the material emergencies in the communities they work in, first and foremost being the desperate need for money to buy food and pay rent. This struggle can be complementary to the overthrow of capitalism rather than contradictory to it. Lastly, the fundamental principles argues that accepting government assistance works to maintain in perpetuity the historical dependence on charity. 90/ and compares it to the begging bowl in modern form. URA's position ignores an important distinction between private charity and the distribution of public resources to disabled people, or to anyone in need, within a community. Indeed, economic assistance and redistribution are in line with Marx's principle from each according to abilities, to each according to, they were just like everyone else. Deafness was perceived very differently and not as a disability in the way that it is in a community where most hearing people are unable to communicate with deaf people. What is considered a disability depends on the context. Intersectionality. A foundational component of the radical model is the idea of intersectional ity, addressing multiple oppressians together and in conjunction with each other. Thai word radical is derived from the Latin, meaning having roots. A conceptualization of disability that did not include, at its base, the acknowledgement of and engagement with the interlocutory nature of oppressians could not be a radical model. Within disability theory, intersectionality is often ignored. For instance, disability studies have been called white disability studies 1, and the exclusion of women in that discipline has already been documented. Eli. 100/. Claire writes further on the lack of intersectionality in radical disability circles. Unfortunately, not many disability or non-disabled progressive groups engage in multi-issue thinking and organizing that deeply embeds disability politics into an agenda that includes race, class, gender, and sexuality. At an ADAPT demo recently, I saw a flyer that read, "You think prison is bad, try a nursing home." In one simple slogan, disability activists advanced a hierarchy of institutions and oppressians, defined disability as their sole focus, and revealed profound ignorance about the ways being locked up in prisons cause bone-crushing damage, particularly in communities of color. This slogan and the disability politics behind it leave little chance for making connections and addressing the daily complexities of folks who know the grief and outrage of both prisons and nursing homes. Disability politics often re-establish whiteness, maleness, straightness, and richness as the center when challenging the marginality of disability. Similarly, when disability studies writers discuss other oppressians, they often do so as distinct phenomena in which different marginalities are compared. When oppressians are discussed in an intersectional road, it is commonly treated like a country road. Two, and only two, separate paths meet at a well-signed, easy-to-understand location. Typically, authors talk about disability and women, disability and class, disability and race, and disability and queerness. None of these lists is complete, and there are, of course, some important exceptions to the common practice of oversimplifying intersectionality. 2. Intersectional. Thai is a multi-lane highway with numerous roads meeting, crossing and merging in chaotic and complicated ways. There are all different kinds off-roads involved, paved and gravel roads, roads with shoulders and those without, and roads with low speed limits, high speed limits, and even no speed limits. There is no map. The most important feature of these intersections, though, is that they look very different depending on your location. With respect to multiply oppressed people, Chris Bell points out that their ethnicity and race are erased, letting them be run over, forgotten 1/101. This is the case for many people with more than one marginality, yet disabled organizers and academics in the field of disability studies negate our complex identities. When disabled people are run over because our identities are omitted, it is no accident. These erasures occur for a number of reasons: prejudice, ignorance, and/or an attempt to distance a group from others in order to better lay claim to privilege. Being real about intersectionality means working to keep people from being run over, as Bell puts it. One way people get run over or left out occurs when some members of the disabled community talk about disability culture. Culture can be used in lots of ways and mean lots of different things. It is important, however, for everyone to recognize that they are a part of a culture. Sometimes white people don't acknowledge that they are a part of a culture because it is so pervasive and dominant that it can be hard for some people to recognize. When disabled people talk about disability culture, it is important that they not erase the many cultures that many disabled people are a part of. Out from under disability. It is highly problematic for disabled people to simply build a rights movement to access privilege, yet this has largely been the case in Canada and the United States. Equally problematic are groups of people who are classified as disabled working to take themselves out from under the disability umbrella in order to build a rights movement to access privilege. Many different groups that fall or have fallen under the disability umbrella have worked to separate themselves from the category of disability to their advantage and to the disadvantage of those they leave behind. Since in the 1970s, deaf people have fought to get out from under the disabled label. According to A Journey into the Deaf World by Lane, Hofmeister, and Bahan, to be deaf is not a disability in deaf culture, and most members of the deaf world see no disability in their way of being. Or, as M.J. Bienvenu has put it, we are proud of our language, culture, and heritage. Disabled we are not. This statement not only works to separate deaf people from the disabled identity, but it also implies that there is no pride in a disabled identity. Psychiatric survivor activists have been working to unaffiliate with the disabled community. This movement has asserted that there is nothing wrong with psychiatrized people and, therefore, they are not disabled. Beresford, Gifford, and Harrison argue in Speaking Our Minds that this is because they understand their disability label as being imposed from above by medical professionals. Many psychiatric system survivors are unwilling to see themselves 102/ as disabled. They associate disability with the medical zation of their distress and experience. They reject the biological and genetic explanations of their distress imposed by medical experts. They may not see themselves as emotionally or mentally distressed either, but instead celebrate their difference and their particular perceptions. Because many psychiatric survivors and mad pride organizers have disablist assumptions about disability and disabled people, they frequently argue that they are not a part of the disabled community. Additionally, a number of the campaigns against forced drugging and ECT invoke disablist arguments to advance their case. Psychiatric survivors have problematized the medical model as it applies only to them, identifying it as abusive and a tool for social control in relation to the psychiatric aspects of medicine, not to the other aspects of the medical model or the model as a whole. Thai trans community is a group of people that has been psychiatrized but, on an organizational level, does not work with psychiatric survivors to achieve non-disabled status. Rather than being protected on the grounds of gender or sex, trans people have human rights protections in New York because GID unconditionally as mentally deficient one. She continues, difference is not a disease, nonconformity is not a pathology, and uniqueness is not an illness. Interestingly, however, there is no consensus on this point. The reason for dissent is the realization that many trans people are poor and cannot afford sex reassignment surgeries, which they would not have access to without the pathologization of the trans identity. As a disabled trans person, I believe the trans community should adopt a radical disability perspective and view disabled people as allies. I think the trans community should fight for medical care without pathologization and use this discussion as a way of challenging the medical system and the existing power structures that the medical system molds its perspectives to. Nevertheless, there are many trans people fighting to take us out from under the disability umbrella. /103. Trans and other psychiatrized people, along with deaf people, have set out to counter the stigma attached to disability and to build a rights movement by arguing that there is nothing wrong with them, ergo, they are not disabled. Trans people argue that there is nothing wrong with them, they experience their bodies and genders in ways that do not align with so-called biological standards. Psychiatric survivors argue that there is nothing wrong with them because they experience or are perceived to experience the world differently. Deaf people argue that there is nothing wrong with them because they are a linguistic minority. These arguments do not contradict the radical disability model whatsoever. However, with deaf trans and psychiatrized people saying that they are not disabled because there is nothing wrong with them, they work to reinforce the idea that there is something wrong with those disabled people they are trying to distance themselves from. While deaf, trans and psychiatrized people are working toward becoming non-disabled, other groups have been far more successful. As already discussed, women were classified as unfit or disabled during the eugenic era. Feminists fought for women's rights and in doing so worked to construct themselves as non-disabled, reinforcing the oppression of those they left behind. Many feminists have perpetuated the construction of women as strong, non-disabled people, saying things like, Female physical frailty is not a reality but a myth with an agenda. Racialized people have also worked to distance themselves from disability. E.R.E. Viles, Kong A. and Middleton have written about some critical race thinkers who have actively sought to distance race from any associations with disability because they have recognized that this association has been used to justify the brutality of slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, and the continued exploitation of people of color. The disability label has been used in horrifyingly violent, even genocidal, ways against racialized people. However, the problem is not disabled people, rather, it is the disability label, and choosing not to talk about it does nothing to disassemble the power structures that allow it to exist. Some anti-racists have also argued that it is demeaning to racial groups to connect disability struggles to anti-racist struggles. Of course, this perspective is demeaning to disabled people and only works to strengthen the idea that we are separate and should remain separate. The mainstream gay rights movement was also successful in being declassified as disabled. While the medical industry had pathologized homosexuality and homosexuals out of hatred, ignorance, and desire for social control, homosexuals looked to this same profession, and specifically to psychiatrists, to depathologize and socially legitimize them. In the 1960s, organized gays 104/ and lesbians took an active role in fighting for change. One of the key aims of the struggle was to establish homosexuality as a minority group rather than a disability. The mainstream gay rights movement argued that the categorization of disability needed to become one of the key battlegrounds in the rights movement. The mainstream gay rights movement built itself through its separation away from other marginalities and its separation from the disability umbrella / in establishing homosexuals as non-disabled. The movement actively organized against being defined as disabled, as well as being against those who defined homosexuals as disabled, the American Psychiatric Association. The APA was the gatekeeper of all psychiatric diagnoses and had the power to psychiatrize homosexuality. This criticism was not of pathologization or the oppressive nature of the classification of disability in general, simply that those in power had erred in classifying them as disabled. This strategy actually worked to maintain disablist oppression and the status quo while negotiating privileged homosexuals' co-optation. In 1973, the mainstream gay rights movement was successful in getting homosexuality detested as a psychiatric disability. Gay psychiatrist Charles Silverstein called it the most important achievement of the gay liberation movement. Out of this, a new minority rights movement was born. Homosexuals would no longer be forcibly confined, electroshocked, drugged, lobotomized and subjected to other horrors simply for being homosexual. Undoubtedly, this is an incredibly important victory in the history of gay rights and one I personally benefit from. However, it is important to examine it critically. It was a victory for many homosexuals at the time, but a lot of homosexuals were left behind. To be gay or lesbian is no longer to be pathological, as white, middle, and upper-class homosexuals and bisexuals are considered to be productive and useful in contemporary society. The mainstream movement has rallied around assimilationist issues like gay marriage, gays in the military and adoption that work to uphold capitalist values and social norms. This is done instead of, and at times at the expense of, organizing in defense of deviant queer lifestyles like polyamory, sex work, transsexuality, transgenderism, and genderqueerness that challenge those values and norms. Many of these ways of living remain psychiatrized and are still considered disabilities. That said, there remains strong opposition on the political right to the integration of strays into mainstream society. The mainstream gay rights movement sold out its disabled members racialized communities, and women also sold out many members of their communities in order to access privilege by winning the status of non-disabled. Griffin Epstein says that there is a national mandate for the formerly marginalized to pick up the mantle of the oppressor in exchange for the rights and privileges of citizenship. With respect to disability, all of these groups have taken up that mantle in order to win reclassification as non-disabled. Those groups that have won a level of marginality that does not include being called disabled largely continue to uphold disablism and maintain separation from disabled people. Indeed, Davina Cooper argues, when one minority group tries to seek equality by breaking away from the stigma produced by association with another group, the claim of equality can further naturalize the other minority group's alienation, i.e. his act of separation often serves to reinforce the justification for the oppression of those left behind. Of course, there are many disabled people who are also members of these groups that have been left behind in these definitional shifts. Beyond continuing to oppress other members of these marginalized groups, there are other reasons that make the struggle to reconstruct these groups as non-disabled problematic. Of course, it is always problematic and disappointing for marginalized groups to participate in the oppression of other marginalized groups. Rather than working in coalitions to challenge the systems that permit the characterization of undesirable people as disabled, these groups have created space for their communities to be at perpetual risk of being reclassified as disabled on other grounds as the needs of those in power shift. Threats of being placed back under the disability umbrella are real for racialized communities, women, and homosexuals. Academics like Rushton and Jensen have devoted their careers to proving the intellectual inferiority of, particularly, black people to build the case that they are disabled. The prospect of the repathologization of women has recently become an issue because of prenatal sex selection. Also, the discovery of a gay gene, which is actively being sought, could lead to the repathologization of homosexuality. These are just some of the ways that these communities could be reclassified as disabled. Because components of these movements have worked to reinforce the idea that disability is bad and undesirable, they will be left with few political options if they face repathologization. Further, these groups all share overlapping populations, so, racialized queer women are especially at risk of being put back into the disability box. Adopting a radical model of disability, rather than trying to break out of the disability category, would problematize the entire disability labeling process. 106. Not just a few communities' membership within it. Successfully eliminating the systems that permit the creation of the category of disability would leave every member of all of these marginalized groups better off. Of course, the reinforcing of oppression in order to get out from under the disability label is only one way that marginalized groups work to uphold the oppression of others. There are countless examples of when and how oppressed groups have targeted or tried to oppress each other for rights and resources. This is because, according to Martin Banton and Gurnam Singh, oppressed groups often succumb to oppressive ideologies. One of the consequences of this is that the group may seek to identify a position within the strata that is superior to as many other groups as possible. When this happens, according to Banton and Singh, oppressed communities can act to reinforce the structures of oppression. Disabled people are not immune to this phenomenon. Disability organizations in Canada and the United States have frequently picked up the mantle of oppression and allowed themselves to be co-opted, rather than build their struggles outward. There are numerous examples of those groups still well under the disability umbrella trying to distance themselves from others to gain privilege. Some physically disabled people were against advocating for the inclusion of people who were psychiatrized or intellectually disabled in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms because it could lower their chances for inclusion. There has also been a great deal of criticism of the disability rights movement for being dominated by physically disabled people. There is also a Facebook group called Being Physically Disabled Does Not Automatically Make Us Stupid. It tells people to join this group and together we can make people change their attitudes towards us. Attitudes that are being changed, though, are the DSAB list attitudes about others, and these attitudes are being reinforced. I have also seen physically disabled people who are the brunt of disablism say that they are smart or that they have a university degree to assert their worth. On the other hand, I know physically disabled people who have been the subjects of pity from intellectually disabled people who operate on the assumption that they have it so much worse. Many intellectually disabled people identify as people who have been labeled The choice to refer to themselves as people who have been labeled without using the word disabled reinforces the idea that there is something negative about being disabled, while addressing the root of the problem, or the fact that the label exists, is out of their control. I think it is important to respect the way that people choose to identify. At the same time, I am critical of this choice as it seems to me to be rooted in disablism. 107. This competitive oppression building is also performed by disability organizations towards those groups that have moved outside of the category of disability. Just one example is how, in Canada and the United States, disabled organizations have fought for accessible public transit, but once ramps, lifts and automatic announcement systems have been put in place, they stop fighting. These organizations don't fight for free or affordable transit or an end to discrimination on public transit, to name but a few causes. 6 movements for change cannot continue to replicate the models of co-optation and oppression. Disability is not actually about those of us who are disabled, it is about those with the power to call us disabled. Indeed, marginality is controlled by those who are not marginalized, which makes it very important to work collectively as oppressed groups to target that power. Further, one cannot choose to only fight disablism, as most disabled people experience more than one form of marginalization and, therefore, more than one form of oppression. This is why poverty, sexism, heterosexism/homophobia, transphobia, racism, and ageism must be fought in tandem. Internationally, most disabled people are racialized. In Canada, rates of disability are disproportionately high among First Nations people, racialized people, and non-European recent immigrants. Also, most disabled people are women. They are more likely than men to report chronic conditions and disabilities. Disabled people are far more likely to be poor than non-disabled people. Many of us are queer and/or trans, and most of us are seniors. Our multiple identities means that if we focus solely on disablism, much like aspects of the disability rights movement has done, then we are working to exclude the majority of disabled people from our struggle, people who would not be able to access the privileges that they would be able to access if they were not disabled. It is important not only to acknowledge the diversity within disabled communities, but also to act in solidarity with other movements. I.e. disability rights and social models have largely failed to fight other oppressions and to work in solidarity with other marginalized groups and anti-oppression movements for change. Rather than fighting for our piece of the pie while working to enforce existing oppression on others, we need to bake a new pie. We have to build new models. To quote longtime activist Beric German, it cannot just be pie in the sky, it has to be pie that you can eat. 108/ Normal, biological, and political constructions. Disability, which includes impairment, is a social construct. In US and Canadian societies, our disabilities are defined by those in power to their own advantage. Who and what counts as disabled shifts depending on what power dictates, oftentimes with broad, sweeping definitions in order to marginalize people. In this society, power and capitalism are intrinsically related. Those in power enable capitalism to function, and capitalism enables those in power to keep their power and obtain more of it. According to Sam Jinden, some people control the potential of others, control how that potential develops over time, privately appropriate the surplus created in social production, and apply that surplus to restructure work, communities, and future opportunities. It is these elites that also control the definition of what is normal and, therefore, what is disabled, in order to maintain and expand influence and control to their benefit. The definition of disability shifts as the needs of those in power shift, as economic and social needs change, so too does the classification of who is disabled. People who are disabled are labeled so because people with power say we are disabled. Since the advent of eugenics, one of the primary reasons we have been, and continue to be, categorized as disabled is because we are considered to be unproductive or underproductive in the capitalist system. In practice, capitalism is a system that is upheld by a number of myths. One of them is that white people are superior to racialized people. Another is that men are superior to women. Capitalism is not necessarily patriarchal and racist, however, the current form of capitalism that operates globally is inherently patriarchal and racist. All forms of capitalism, however, are innately oppressive and work to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Also, there is a myth that some people have power and wealth because they work hard and others are lazy, and that there is one ideal that people must strive to achieve. In order to maintain our belief in the capitalist myths, they need to be socially imposed. Those of us who violate the goal of striving for the ideal or who challenge our roles within the socio-economic system face consequences for our deviance. Sometimes these consequences are legal, such as forced confinement and treatment of many psychiatrized people, but more often they are economic and social. We are made into examples, we are denied the resources, joys, comforts, jobs and pleasures that normal people have access to. We are then punished for our low productivity by way of systemic discrimination, poverty, dehumanization, degrading, and violence. This is the punishment used against us. Importantly, though, it is also a lesson for everyone else to /109. Do everything that they can not to become like us. Under capitalism, individual productivity is linked to individual worth. The more you produce, the more money you make and the more valuable you are to society. As productivity and worth are measured entirely in monetary terms, people who are left out of the system, such as disabled people, are worthless. Of course, most disabled people who are excluded from paid labor are left out because of discrimination and inadequate workplace accommodation. Rather than arguing that disabled people can be productive in a capitalist paradigm, the radical model of disability sees capitalist values as problematic. People should not be valued by how much money we make, how much we produce, or how much we contribute to an unsustainable and unjust economy. This is not a romantic or superficial point. This is an important contribution that radical disability theory can make to radical politics today. Frequently, people who are organizing or agitating for social justice retain this core capitalist value. We often view other people's value through their contributions to the struggle, through how much work they do or how productive they are. If we truly want to create a just society, we must value people as people, not as producers. What is considered normal or non-disabled is constructed around certain kinds of people, while leaving others out. Another myth that is firmly upheld is that disabled people are dependent and non-disabled people are independent. No one is actually independent. This is a myth perpetuated by disablism and driven by capitalism. We are all actually interdependent. Chances are, disabled or not, you don't grow all of your food. Chances are, you didn't build the car, bike, wheelchair, subway, shoes, or bus that transports you. Chances are you didn't construct your home. Chances are you didn't sew your clothing. The difference between the needs that many disabled people have and the needs of people who are not labeled as disabled is that non-disabled people have had their dependencies normalized. The world has been built to accommodate certain needs and call the people who need those things independent, while other needs are considered exceptional. Each of us relies on others every day. We all rely on one another for support, resources, and to meet our needs. We are all interdependent. This interdependence is not weakness, rather, it is a part of our humanity. However, disabled people are constructed as dependent and deviant rather than independent and normal. If we look at who was originally classified as disabled under the first modern categorization of disability in Western society: poor people, women, homosexuals, racialized people, physically disabled people and intellectually disabled people. The links 110/ between unproductivity and the categorization of deviance and disability are apparent. While there are clear capitalist functions for the eugenic classifications of disability, it is important to recognize that the oppression that these groups experience is not rooted solely in capitalism. Sexism, heterosexism/homophobia, disablism, and racism all exist outside of capitalism, and it would be irresponsible to argue that replacing capitalism would alleviate all oppression. Legislative definitions of disability. What is constructed as disability is informed by numerous forms of oppression and has dearly changed over time. Even within a set period of time, however, definitions change depending on the intended outcome. The greater amount of access to resources and rights a piece of legislation involves, the stricter the definition becomes. Upon the examination of 4 legal definitions of disability that are used in the Americans with Disabilities Act and Supplementary Security Income in the United States, and the accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act and Ontario Disability Support Program in Canada, the way that legislation and legal precedents influence social definitions of disability becomes clear. In the United States, one of the most widespread definitions of disability is outlined in the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ABA defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of such individual / or having a record of / or being regarded as having an impairment. This definition was interesting because it diverged from the medical model, in part. It used a more right/social model definition because it included people who were regarded as disabled. However, in 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court tightened the definition of disability under the ADA. People who had easily correctable disabilities like nearsightedness or high blood pressure were no longer considered disabled. They were told, according to Michael Berube, that they had no basis for a suit under the ADA precisely because their disabilities were easily correctable. ULIs meant people filing suit under the ADA were too disabled to be hired but somehow not disabled enough to be covered by the ADA, or, to put it this way, plaintiffs' easily correctable disabilities were not so easily correctable as to allow them access to employment. The broad ADA definition of disability did not legally protect disabled people from discrimination because the U.S. Supreme Court found that 160 million people would be classified as disabled. This number was considered too high, so the definition was shifted to accommodate business owners rather than victims of disablist discrimination. Number of people that were able to /111 litigate against businesses was dramatically reduced, which would limit potential liability in order to permit fewer people the chance to access resources and accommodations. The ADA definition was made more restrictive. An amendment introduced to the ADA in 2008 was designed to refocus the definition of disability. However, people who need to use eyeglasses continue to be exempt from the Act, and it remains to be seen what, if any, impact the changes will actually have. The ADA is complaint-driven. Typically, an individual who has been discriminated against must have the time, energy, and resources to engage in the court system to seek a remedy to the discrimination. In order to be successful, people also need evidence that is often difficult or impossible to obtain. Also, litigation requires resources that many people do not have access to. However, many property owners, businesses, and corporations have ample resources to defend themselves in the courts. Further, the ADA, like the other acts I will discuss in this section, does nothing to address systemic barriers, and, while it appears to be broad and encompass a great number of people, the actual number of people who successfully pursue litigation is quite small. From July 1992 to September 2005 there were over 230,000 claims filed under the ADA for employment discrimination. Of these, roughly 33,000 ended in favor of the complainant. Only 2.2% of successful claims were actually won through the courts, the rest were settled or otherwise resolved. While this legislation has helped specific individuals remedy discrimination, its overall impact is nowhere near what is needed to undermine disability in the United States. Canada does not have federal disability legislation that is comparable to the ADA. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects against government discrimination on the grounds of disability. Additionally, each province has a human rights code that contains protections for disabled people. However, human rights law does not necessarily entail physical inaccessibility or lack of interpreters, for example. Like the ADA, however, this legislation is largely complaint-driven. In Ontario, the country's most populated province, there is disability-specific legislation, the Ontarians with Disabilities Act. This law only requires governments to make accessibility plans, not actually to take action. In 2025, the ODA will be replaced by the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, a piece of legislation much more similar to the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ODA and the AIDA define disability as any degree of physical disability, infirmity, malformation, or disfigurement that is caused by bodily injury, birth defect or illness, mental impairment or a developmental disability, a learning disability, or a mental disorder. 112/ Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, 2005, 2. This definition is incredibly broad, but provides little meaningful assistance for disabled people. Additionally, the government has refused to enact the SEC, making it an offense to break this law, so it is essentially useless except, of course, to the governing party who enacted the law, as they received extensive positive media coverage from its passage. Where the benefit to disabled people is greater and has a meaningful impact on people's lives, the definition of disability becomes much more restrictive. Supplementary Security Income and the Ontario Disability Support Program provide monthly amounts to people on disability who are declared unable to work. They both require medical documentation of conditions that are terminal or will last at least a year. Disability in the case of supplementary security income must lead to an inability to engage in any substantial gainful activity, which to the American government means productive, paid employment. With respect to the Ontario Disability Support Program, the definition also involves a substantial restriction in one or more activities of daily living which are personal care, paid work, or operating in the community. Neither SSI nor ODSP account for systemic discrimination in employment. This means that there are disabled people who cannot work because they are disabled, but cannot access disability social assistance because they are not disabled under the legislated definition. The ADA and human rights legislation are supposed to remedy this, but they don't, just as civil rights legislation did not end employment discrimination on the grounds of race or racism in general. Because there is a discrepancy between who counts as disabled under the ADA and under SSI, there is a class of people who are unable to obtain employment and are unable to get income support. These people are disabled only when it is to other people's benefit, not their own. Implications of definitions of disability. When people actually get access to money, accommodations, equipment, or attendant care, such as those individuals defined under social assistance legislation like SSI and ODSP, the definitions of disability are rewritten, classifying very few people as disabled. But, for legislation that is general, like the ADA and, especially, the DA, the definition is broad and aimed at reaching as many voters as possible. While there may be some benefit to being defined as disabled/113. Under certain pieces of legislation, this is primarily not to benefit us but rather to benefit those in power. The same government that celebrated itself for passing the Ontarians with Disabilities Act arbitrarily changed the definition of disabled for social assistance, which led to thousands of people no longer being considered disabled and hence no longer eligible to receive financial support. Similarly, the Conservative government in British Columbia redefined disability and required people receiving assistance to submit 23 pages of forms to reprove they were disabled in order to retain their benefits, and the United States, the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act redefined disability, resulting in 100,000 children losing their benefits. These definitions were all made more restrictive in order to reduce benefits for many people and to save the government money. When there is little or no benefit, but lots of stigma, to being disabled, definitions are broad. But definitions increasingly narrow as the level of and access to resources increases. These definitions, like all definitions of marginalized people, are used as forms of control, creating large groups of others when it is useful. Further, these definitions remain under the control of those with power and can be changed to serve their needs and desires. Who is disabled? People are disabled. We are disabled if those in power say we are. This is an identity that is fully out of our control. However, because it is out of our control, there are some people who are not allowed into the disability grouping because they need to access resources. By denying people the identity of disabled, they are automatically refused resources, accommodations, social assistance, and human rights protections. This is the plight of many people with non-apparent, or invisible/disabilities. Further, as long as our communities remain classified in the category of disabled, rather than hold the power to create the category itself/we will have a divided disabled community, one that is unlikely to build unity and a base of resistance together. So, who is disabled? Anyone who is identified or who identifies as disabled. As Tom Shakespeare contends, defining disability in terms of social barriers or social oppression, rather than a biological impairment, opens up the category to a range of other socially excluded or devalued groups. The problem with this argument is that it assumes that biological impairment and social oppression are severable, which they are not. Shakespeare takes opposition to, for example, fat people being included in the disability identity group. However, I argue that fatness is a disability. Obesity is a medicalized 114/ condition and commonly regarded as a disability, at least depending on the definition. In Cook v. Rhode Island Department of Mental Health, Retardation, and Hospitals, the court found that Ms. Cook was disabled under the ADA. She was a fat woman who was not hired because she was presumed to be disabled by her obesity. The ADA defines a disabled person who has, or is regarded as having, substantial limitations performing major life activities. One of these activities is working, and Ms. Cook was unable to work because she was regarded as disabled, therefore, she was disabled under the law. This was a curtail case, as Cook continues to have positive employment implications for fat people. An interesting circular definition of disability was established in this case, wherein if someone is fat and perceived to be disabled and that perception prevents them from working, then that person is disabled. This First Circuit Court demonstrates what a radical understanding of disability looks like. Those with power considered someone as disabled, treated her as if she was disabled and, therefore, she was disabled. The correlations and/or intersectionality between fatness and disablism have also been discussed by a number of authors. Like other forms of disability, the definition of and the attention paid to fatness or obesity has shifted with social values. Charlotte Cooper writes, "Many fat people grow up fearing our own bodies in shame, public ridicule, and social ostracism, and the cultural fear and hatred of us can ruin our lives. I believe that self-defining as disabled enables us to take ourselves seriously and demand others do also." April Herndon asserts disability needs to be understood as a diverse social category that can meaningfully incorporate fat embodiments. Cooper goes on to say, "Fat people's demands are regarded as trivial compared to those of disabled people, thus, the notion of civil rights for fat people is little more than a joke." Shakespeare and other disabled authors and activists perpetuate the trivialization of fat people's experiences and demands by their conscious exclusion of fat people from the disability umbrella. Further, as disabled people have so commonly been the brunt of the other end of this dynamic, the ones excluded, the ones who have had their oppression supported by groups trying to reduce theirs, we should not be doing the same thing to others. Some people raise the concern that there will be people who identify as disabled who aren't actually disabled. However, people do not claim marginality of their own choosing. There may be extreme or hypothetical circumstances in which such a situation might occur, but it doesn't make sense to exclude people based on imagined worst-case scenarios. If we fail to let people self-identify as disabled, we also run the /115 risk of legitimizing the medical model of disability, as it is the primary and oftentimes exclusive mechanism for labeling disability. Self-identification is the only way that people claim membership in the queer community, and it has worked out fine. Imagine if queers were afraid that straights would start identifying as queer in order to get access to the few benefits that we have, that we made people go to a doctor to get documentation they were queer. A parallel example of this gatekeeper phenomenon is when women-only spaces exclude trans women. This is often justified on the basis that a man could come into the space, say he is a woman, and be violent. In reality, a man or a woman could come into that space and be violent. In a situation like that, which is an imagined worst-case scenario, you deal with the behavior at the time. As someone who has done training for homeless shelters, some of which were women-only spaces, I have had this same conversation a number of times with staff and residents. For the most part, I do not think that people raise issues out of malice but out of fear. The reality is that these hypothetical situations aren't going to happen, and if they do, we can collectively deal with the situations that arise. Further, because disablism is so deeply internalized in many disabled people, we may be hesitant to ask for accommodations. In my experience with the disabled people in my life, we don't abuse accommodations, we ask for fewer than we need or than would be helpful. There is a tremendous amount of stigma around disability, so disabled people are less likely to ask for what we need, not the other way around. Forcing people to prove they are disabled is not the solution to the hypothetical problem of non-disabled people saying they are disabled in order to gain advantages. Disabled people have been overwhelmingly excluded from society. Our community shouldn't replicate the same problems. Disabled people's spaces can be empowering and important to our sense of well-being and belonging. We need to relearn ways of building community, rather than replicate the flawed divisions that have been forced on us for so long. Difficulty and trouble, real experiences of being disabled, because many disabled people find pride in our disabled minds and bodies. This doesn't mean that we don't have difficulty with them. Sometimes, we do. But these difficulties are not because we are disabled, we experience them because we are human. Everyone gets frustrated with their minds and their bodies at some point. In spite of disablist discourse, this is not unique to those of us classified as disabled. One of the key criticisms of the social model has been that it does not give 116 space for people to talk about the difficulty that they have with their minds and bodies. Over a decade ago, Michael Oliver countered this criticism, saying that there just needed to be a social model of impairment to complement the social model of disability. However, within the hegemony of the social model, there has been an understanding that there is a separation between our political, public presentation and our private lives. To say we should just wait for a social model of impairment is simplistic and dismissive. I feel a lot of pressure from social modelists not to talk about the trouble that we have with our disability labels and our minds and bodies. I feel a responsibility to our fight for justice not to say certain things. Tom Shakespeare writes, "Many disability rights campaigners concede that behind closed doors they talk about aches and pains and urinary tract infections, even while they deny any relevance of the body while they are out campaigning. Yet this inconsistency is surely wrong. If the public rhetoric says one thing, while everyone behaves privately in a more complete way, then perhaps it is time to re-examine the rhetoric and speak more accurately. There is, however, a real fear for me, and I would guess the same for many others as well, to talk about my difficult experiences with my body. A few years ago, I wrote about how hard it is. I am afraid that I will help fuel the fires of hatred against disabled people. If I say that my life can be painful and isolating, that could be used to support the argument that disabled people do not have full and rewarding lives. If I address the difficulty that many disabled people have accessing support and the tension that that puts on personal relationships, it could be manipulated to contend that disability should be eliminated to spare parents from the burden of having a disabled child. If I talk about the depression, and even the sense of worthlessness, that can go along with chronic illness, chronic pain, and limited access, it might be twisted around to bolster the position that we aren't worthy of life. If I honestly talk about the struggles that I endure on a daily basis, what we have to say about our lives and the world may be reduced to inspirational material rather than meaningful and important interpretations of the world around us. These are the secrets I have kept in order to help to build a movement. We all keep secrets. /117. We need to create space, within a radical theory of disability for people to talk about our difficulties. This does not mean that people who are identified as disabled necessarily have more trouble with our minds or bodies than non-disabled people. This does not mean that our difficulties are permanent or stagnant, rather, our perceptions of our minds and bodies shift depending on any number of factors. We refuse to talk about our lives, and our troubles around them, instead of talking about them openly within a radical framework. As a result, all it takes is one Christopher Reeve calling for a cure and saying merely being alive is not enough to reinforce the disablist notions that our arguments are wrong and our lives really are worth less, or even worthless. Our politics cannot draw distinctions between our public and our private lives. We cannot draw arbitrary lines down our lives, leaving out parts of our lived experiences because they are not convenient to our arguments. We need a disability politic that is true to our lives, one that doesn't make us keep secrets that ultimately weaken our arguments. Disability pride can coexist with our real minds, bodies, and lived experiences, which can include the joys and the difficulties that our diversity brings. Perfectly healthy people who never struggle with their minds and bodies, who are never challenged by them, do not exist. This ideal is a construct to perpetuate disabled people's marginalization. Evolutionary biologist Marlene Zuk argues that diseases have evolutionary purposes and are a basic presence in all of human existence. Zuk cautions against a war on disease. What we should hope for is not victory, but reconciliation. Reconciliation, with respect to disability, would mean an acceptance of human diversity, including the fact that we all have different minds, bodies, needs and abilities. It would mean welcoming the different perspectives that this diversity brings. The kinds of people who are currently labeled disabled have always been a part of our population and offer important perspectives and contributions. Disabled people are often celebrated for our accomplishments in spite of our disabilities. We are rarely recognized for the contributions we make because of our disabilities. For instance, when I am having a hard time walking, I walk very slowly and I notice a lot of what is around me. Because I experience the world differently than many of the people around me, I have a unique and useful perspective. Radical access. Within the disability rights and social models, accessibility means different things depending on who you are talking to and when you are talking to them. Ideas of accessibility were often more restricted and solely focused on physical. 118. Access in decades past, but the ideas surrounding access have begun to expand. Like all disability models coming from disabled people, one of the key issues is access. However, the radical model does not advocate solely for ramps and lifts, though physical accommodations should always be present. We advocate and agitate for radical access. Access needs to be addressed collectively across bodies, boundaries, and borders. Radical access means acknowledging systemic barriers that exclude people, particularly certain kinds of people with certain lands of minds and/or bodies, and working to ensure not only the presence of those who have been left out, but also their comfort, participation, and leadership. Spaces that need to incorporate radical access principles are organizational, they are educational and institutional, but they are also the spaces closest to us, our cafes, our offices, our homes, and our hearts. Radical access is not about universal design or universal access that is an arbitrary and fictional concept. According to Ron Mace, the man who coined the term universal design, it is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people, to the greatest extent possible, without the need for adaptation or specialized design. The problem with this concept is that people and their needs change. An obvious, and unfair, example is that if a building that fits a universal design or access mold is in Finland and I cannot go to Finland, then it isn't accessible to me. However, even if the building is downtown, but transit is expensive and I don't have the money, or if I am a black man and the streetcar refuses to stop to let me on, or if I am a wheelchair user and the streetcar is not physically accessible to me, that building is not universally accessible. Access doesn't just begin at the front door. When I was much younger and was relatively new to activism, I frequently talked about identity groups exclusively as groups, not about the many individual people who make up those groups. One of the most valuable things that developing the radical disability model and radical access politics have taught me is that I cannot simply paint groups with one brush. Access politics demand that we treat people as people and look at each of our needs and how to collectively meet them. While there are specific, basic demands that we need to put in place to ensure some standards of accessibility, each of us has our own needs, and access should be collectively negotiated between everyone involved. This negotiation is never neutral and cannot take place without considering present-day oppression, as well as the histories of oppression. This negotiation is not about creating room for people in spite of their marginality but recognizing that everyone deserves space and that their membership in an oppressed group brings perspectives and experiences that are not only welcome but wanted. Radical access also includes intentional and accessible use of language. This /119 means that one strives to communicate in ways that are easily understood. It also means that oppressive language is not used. This includes DSAB list language, which is pervasive within North America and the left. Sometimes, however, words do have multiple meanings according to the dictionary. Paralyze can mean to fully stop, deaf can mean to refuse to listen, disable can mean to break or turn off, and crazy can mean ridiculous. But, as Chris Chapman says, while these words have acceptable usages about things other than people, in terms of what dictionaries say, one would suggest that it is impossible to use these words without avoicing people. Chapman argues that whatever dictionaries say, it would be impossible for me to say gay and have it only signify happy double usage or not. Disablist slurs need to be stripped out of everyday language if we want to create spaces where disabled people feel welcome and wanted. No space is ever accessible if oppressive language is being used, no matter what other measures are taken to make it so. Conclusion. Uli's model would not have been possible to imagine before the disability rights movement, the social model, or the important work of many radical activists and thinkers. There are also many directions this model could go in. For example, there could be important shifts in language. For instance, the term disability justice is used, largely on the west coast of the United States, to radically respond to the disability rights movement. Also, a disabled friend of mine, Amanda Dorter, has started using the word disabilize to talk about disabled people in order to better indicate the imposition of the disability label. As people begin to see themselves, and others, in increasingly radical ways, our politics and the words that we use to talk about them will evolve. It is important, however, that the fundamental tenets of the model, the necessity of recognizing and relating to intersectionality, that disability is a social construction, that the disability label is imposed as a tactic to retain power and social control, and that we have to create space for each other both in terms of acknowledging our lived experiences and ensuring accessibility remain intact. Rather than perpetuating unrealistic ideals for humans, radical disability theory calls for reassessing and revaluing people. We should not be penalized for falling outside of arbitrary and unjust norms of productivity and independence. There is nothing wrong with us. We should be celebrated for our diversities and our perspectives. Radical access and radical disability theory are not fringe ideas, they are fundamental ideas looking at the essence of what disability and access mean for everyone. Radical disability theory is about fighting to redistribute power and resources and creating accessible spaces and communities. 120/ By fighting to make it happen, I literally mean that we have to fight. Radical access and an end to disablism will never be handed to us. We have to work together to demand and create change. We have to move beyond the identity politic of physical access and work to create access for all. We have to constantly and consistently confront our own actions and ways of reinforcing oppression. Perhaps most importantly though, we must organize. We must work in solidarity with other marginalized groups, and we must get past our differences and fight for justice, dignity, equality, and access.